Chapter 1049. The reason for such a conclusion was very simple. As the way of martial arts derived from the world of laws continued to improve and improve, it became more and more complementary to the world of laws, making the changes in the world of laws clearer and clearer. Thus, Luo Fan was able to make greater supplements to the world of laws, allowing the world of laws to continue to grow. And this kind of growth, in turn, acted on the Tao fruit great way that he had created according to the world of laws, allowing him to have a deeper understanding of the Tao fruit great way, thus allowing his cultivation realm to grow. At this moment, he was still in the realm of beginner Tao master, but faintly he was already close to the bottleneck of the initial realm. It seemed that he would soon break through the bottleneck and become a Tao master of the initial realm. The realm of Tao master was similar to the previous realms, divided into 4 small realms. Beginner, initial realm, profound realm, peak realm. It corresponded to the 4 small realms of peak sage to be, beginner, initial realm, profound realm, peak realm. At this time, Luo Fan was still in the beginner realm, but he could already fight with the battle god Sun, who had surpassed the peak of peak sage to be and set foot on the 3rd step. When he achieved a breakthrough, the power of his divine sense would obviously be greatly improved. At that time, it would be even easier to fight with the battle god Sun. Even if it was impossible to defeat the battle god Sun, it would not be like now. He would need to be careful to avoid being torn apart by the battle god Sun. The reason why Luo Fan had such progress was very simple. It was the whole process of the battle between the battle god Sun and his clone. Luo Fan had been watching with the help of the universe. This kind of watching was not like watching a movie, but a kind of specific and detailed observation. It could even cut into their feelings at any time and experience it from their own point of view. Compared to watching a movie from the sidelines, this kind of mystical spectator effect was many times stronger. The battle god Sun and the others had been fighting for 10 years, and Luo Fan had experienced their feelings for 10 years. In this kind of mysterious observation, the divine sense that the battle god Sun and the others displayed and the power that they exerted. It was the operation of the power in their bodies, the circulation of the mental cultivation method, and even the various benefits they obtained from the magic treasures in their hands, all flowed through his mind without leaving anything out. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's understanding of the battle tactics they had displayed was extremely profound. It was even stronger than the 2 of them. It turned all of these into nutrients for his own cultivation progress. To be able to make such a huge progress, it was natural. When Luo Fan sealed the battle god Sun into the 3-dimensional seal, the other cultivators on Qilin Cliff couldn't see it clearly, but Wu Daozi and Ashen Muzi below could see it clearly. Luo Fan. The 2 of them were currently being suppressed, so their eyesight and perception were naturally weakened. He simply couldn't see what was happening inside Luo Fan's 3-dimensional talisman. In their eyes, Luo Fan casually took out a strange object and directly sealed the battle god Sun of the battle god Sun of the talisman seal. Then, the battle god Sun of the battle god Sun floated motionlessly in the void. There were no fluctuations of power from his body, as if he had not used any techniques. Seeing this, it was easy to imagine what they would think. Naturally, they would think that Luo Fan had casually sealed the battle god Sun. Moreover, this seal lasted for 10 years. This made them feel that Luo Fan's strength was unfathomable. In their hearts, they were more afraid of Luo Fan than of the battle god Sun. Although the battle god Sun was strong, they could still understand and measure his strength. As for the Luo Fan in front of them, if they said he was strong, his cultivation level was only equivalent to a beginner peak quasi-sage. Compared to the 2 of them, he was still much weaker. However, even though he was weak, he was able to easily defeat them. He could even casually seal the battle god Sun, who had suppressed the 2 of them. If he was weak, then what were they? Ants? Dregs? Or mayflies that were born and dead? For a moment, the way they looked at Luo Fan was extremely vigilant. At this moment, Wu Daozi no longer had the thought of subduing Luo Fan. To him, Luo Fan had become a god of plague. He could not wait for Luo Fan to leave immediately and never appear in front of him again. Of course, Luo Fan did not care about what Wu Daozi and Ashen Muzi thought. At this moment, the most important thing to him was the battle between the two battle godsons in the inner universe of the three-dimensional seal. The various mysteries of battle revealed in the battle were constantly being transformed into the mysteries of martial arts by him. They were constantly being integrated into his worldview, allowing his cultivation level to increase at a speed that he could perceive. The mysterious charm on his body became more and more obvious and powerful. Time gradually passed. In the blink of an eye, another 80 years had passed. During these 80 years, both Luo Fan and the Battle God Sun had completely forgotten about the outside world. At the beginning, the Battle God Sun still had the idea of defeating his clone as soon as possible and breaking through this strange universe. However, as time passed and he gained more and more benefits from the battle, he gradually threw this idea to the back of his mind. The Battle God Sun was the new name he had used for more than 90 years. For hundreds of millions of years before that, the name of the Battle God Sun had always been Battle God Sun. To Madman Do, fighting was his cultivation, his pleasure, and the life that he yearned for day and night. As long as there was battle, even if the sky fell and the earth cracked, the universe was destroyed, and the sun and moon sank, it did not matter to him. At this moment, he had already become the Battle God Sun and understood the true meaning of battle. He no longer treated battle as everything and allowed battle to surpass everything. However, fighting was still where his interest lay. It was also where his cultivation lay. The encounter before him might have made him feel miserable and painful, but it also allowed him to enjoy the indescribable joy of battle. In the outside world, he wanted to find someone so similar to him. The difficulty of finding a cultivator who was so powerful and could fight on par with him was so great that it was almost impossible. With his experience, he didn't need to think too much to know about this. Here, however, there was a cultivator who looked exactly the same as him. In fact, a cultivator who was even stronger than him could fight him for an eternity. How good a thing was that? How lucky was that? This change in mentality made him enjoy the battle even more. His own strength grew faster and faster because of this change in mentality, and it became more and more obvious as he fought against his clone. That performance. Gradually, he no longer looked so miserable. Gradually, they started exchanging blows with each other, and the battle scene became more and more interesting. And he had such a change. For Luo Fan, the benefits were naturally even greater. The increase in his strength allowed Luo Fan to understand the mysteries of the way of battle more carefully, and thus be able to transform more of it into the mysteries of martial arts. As a result, his worldview became more and more enriched, and in turn, his cultivation realm continued to grow. On a certain day, after 80 years, Luo Fan's body suddenly shook. His aura began to spread uncontrollably in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it filled every inch of space on the Qilin Cliff. As this aura filled the air, all the cultivators on the Qilin Cliff, including Wu Dao Zi and Ashen Mu Zi, felt a sense of joy. They felt an indescribable feeling of enlightenment, as if they had suddenly comprehended some mysteries that they didn't even know what they were. This is a breakthrough in cultivation, but why aren't there any signs? Wu Dao Zi and Ashen Mu Zi were both shocked. They looked at each other and saw confusion in each other's eyes. However, in comparison, there was a hint of understanding in the depths of Wu Dao Zi's confusion. He remembered that when Luo Fan broke through to the peak of the Sage-to-Be realm, there were no signs. Even at that time, there were no signs of the aura that spread uncontrollably. In comparison, this small breakthrough in front of them had such an aura that covered the entire Qilin Cliff. This didn't seem to be an incredible thing. Their guess was right. At this moment, it was the sign that Luo Fan's cultivation had broken through, after watching and comprehending for more than 80 years. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't seem to encounter any bottlenecks. He quietly broke through the bottleneck between the initial stage and the initial stage of the Dao Master Realm. It was unimaginably easy for him to reach the initial stage of the Tao Master Realm. This could be said to be the easiest breakthrough he had ever made. The speed at which he broke through exceeded the imagination of all cultivators. It took him nearly 10 million years to break the shackles of the realm and become a Tao Master from the end of the Transcendent Realm. But now it only took him more than 90 years to reach the second realm, the initial realm of Tao Master. Let alone 10 million years, it was less than 100 years. Although the shackles between the initial stage and the initial stage of the Tao Master Realm were not as strong as the shackles between the Transcendent Realm and the initial stage of the Tao Master Realm, it was more because Luo Fan's cultivation speed was much faster than before. In fact, this was to be expected. Just by looking at the opponents that Luo Fan had encountered after becoming a Tao Master, one could understand why he made such rapid progress. It only took him less than 100 years to achieve such a huge breakthrough. Wu Dao Zi was at the peak of the Sage-to-Be realm, a powerful existence who had set foot on the second stage. In terms of cultivation realm, he was tens of thousands of times stronger than Luo Fan, who had just entered the Tao Master realm. Ashen Muzi and Wu Dao Zi were equally matched. In terms of cultivation realm, they were also tens of thousands of times stronger than Luo Fan. After that, he saw the attacks of Shun Chan Zi, Wu Wei Zi, Rain God Zi, and other practitioners who had set foot on the second stage, as well as Fuda Zi, who had set foot on the third stage, against Mad Do Zi. He even saw the whole process of Mad Do Zi stepping from the second stage to the third stage. Now, he directly watched the battle between Battle God Zi, who had set foot on the third stage, and the clone, who was stronger than him, for nearly 100 years. If he couldn't comprehend something from such an encounter and improve his cultivation realm, then with his current strength and worldview, he would probably fall from the sky. At this moment, Luo Fan only felt refreshed. The world in his eyes was much richer than before. His eyes penetrated through the layers of barriers and saw the chaotic state. The range was 10 times wider than before, and the things he saw were also 10 times more detailed than before. Under such a perspective, he even found many imperfections in his worldview, and faintly had some new understanding of the deepening of his worldview. As for the magic power in his body, his Zenith Heaven Tao fruit, his body, his mind, his will, and his senses, all of them were affected. His godly soul, everything had made great progress. In a trance, he felt that he could easily deal with 100 of himself from before, and it would be extremely easy. The kind of absolute victory. What a pity, compared to Battle God Z and the others. In fact, it is just a little easier. It is still almost impossible to defeat them. Luo Fan slightly measured his own strength. He could not help but feel helpless. Luo Fan was able to fight with Battle God Z, Wu Dao Z, and the others. In fact, most of it was not because of his own strength. Instead, he relied on his understanding of the chaotic state and the difference between his cultivation method and theirs. He used the grayish existence in the gap between heaven and earth and the chaotic state to assist him in battle. Relying on the special effect of the grayish existence, he could appear to be on par with them, and even made them feel that he was unfathomable. If he fought with his own strength, or even when he was fighting with Wu Dao Zi, he would have been suppressed and subdued. At this moment, Luo Fan's cultivation realm had a breakthrough, which greatly improved his strength. However, there was no essential change in his use of the grayish existence. Although there was some improvement, it did not reach the point of a qualitative change. In this way, although it would be easier for him to fight against the Battle God Sun and the others and perform more freely, the difficulty of truly suppressing and defeating them was not much different from before. After sighing, Luo Fan suddenly felt that there was not much meaning in continuing to fight. It was almost impossible for him to defeat Battle God Z, and it was also extremely difficult for Battle God Z to defeat him. As long as he slightly changed the three-dimensional talisman formed by the long river to protect himself, he would be in an invincible position. He had just made a breakthrough in his cultivation realm, And if he wanted to make another breakthrough, he would need to accumulate a certain amount of experience before he could do it. If he wanted to rely on spectating the battle between the battle god sun and his clone to stimulate his own cultivation realm to advance again, it was already too unrealistic. This was not contradictory. It was just like the understanding of the aura rune structure. The aura rune structure contained the profoundness of the sage's path. However, the benefit that Luo Fan could obtain from it was only to break through the shackles of the transcendent realm. It was difficult for him to continue to obtain more. Although Battle God Z's cultivation realm was much stronger than Luo Fan's, to Luo Fan, it was already his limit to make such progress in his cultivation realm. At the very least, it was so in a short period of time. As for what would happen in the long run, it was uncertain. Under such circumstances, it was obviously meaningless to continue fighting with the battle god sun like this. With such a thought in mind, Luo Fan wanted to stop the universe's operation and release Battle God Z. Unexpectedly, at this moment, Battle God Z in the universe suddenly let out a long roar. The long rod in his hand shook violently, and the golden light on his body was completely withdrawn. However, this withdrawal did not completely disappear. Instead, it seemed to be completely condensed in his body. One could faintly see the golden light on his body, but it was difficult to see where the golden light was and what form it was. After the golden light changed, Battle God Z gently waved the long rod in his hand. It instantly penetrated all the defenses of his clone and directly hit the clone's head. In an instant, the head of the clone turned into nothingness, as if it had never been there in the first place. Then, as the clone's head turned into nothingness, the clone's entire body also turned into nothingness. The long rod in the clone's hand was the same as the Battle God Z's. So powerful. Luo Fan's expression changed greatly at this moment. At this moment, the Son of War God's strength seemed to have suddenly increased by 1,000 times. The clone that had been able to fight him to a stalemate for nearly 100 years couldn't even withstand a single move from him and was directly destroyed. The moment the clone was destroyed, the universe's great path suddenly collapsed. It lost its support along with the clone and could no longer continue to exist. The universe's great path was shattered, and the entire universe shook violently. Countless cracks appeared out of nowhere like rivers that spanned across the universe, causing the universe to become fragmented in the blink of an eye. This is the real third stage. Only when the ape's figure completely fuses with the body is this state where all the power is completely used. The golden light that exploded and the ape's figure enveloped the body was simply a sign of power leaking and not being able to control it perfectly. Suddenly, Luo Fan had an indescribable realization. At this moment, thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Strange words that described the Battle God Z's current situation continuously formed in his mind, and then continuously fused with the three-dimensional talisman through mysterious connections. As these words fused with the talisman, the great path of the universe gradually gathered together. The river-like cracks that spanned across the entire universe began to gradually close up. Seeing this, Battle God Z was shocked. His long roar of joy instantly stopped. Chapter 1050. Just as he disappeared from this part of the universe instantly returned to its normal state. It even seemed to be stronger and more stable than before. In fact, the great Tao in the unseen world had become even stronger. Its essence had become even more powerful. He ran fast. Just wait a little longer, and a newer and stronger clone will appear. What a pity. Luo Fan's voice rang out in this part of the universe. That voice contained a sense of pity. The one who spoke was, of course, Luo Fan. What he felt right now was truly a pity. In that instant, it was the Battle God Sun who had taken advantage of the shock caused by his destruction of the clone and the weakness of the laws of the universe, where the cracks were located to break out of this universe. At this moment, he had already left the three-dimensional seal and could no longer be manipulated by him. If he had waited a little longer and waited for him to finish adjusting this universe, Then this universe would become complete again, and the clone that was no different from the current battle god son would also reappear. At that time, even if the battle god son was much stronger than before and could even easily destroy the clone that was no different from his original self, the overall situation would not be too different from before, because the new clone that appeared would still be no different from the current him. It would still be that terrifying, and they would still be evenly matched. The reason why Luo Fan felt that there was no point in continuing the battle and that he would not gain much from it was that he was already too familiar with the battle god son. He was so familiar that he could not feel anything from watching him fight. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no point in continuing the battle if he wanted to gain anything from the battle. But now, the battle god son had obtained such a huge improvement. All of his remarkable techniques had already undergone new changes. To him, it had become fresh once again. If he continued to fight, he would be able to gain new insights. Naturally, there would be many benefits for him. As such, of course, he hoped that he could continue the battle. As such, how could he not feel pity for the battle god's son to escape his control? After feeling pity, Luo Fan sighed and turned his head to look. He saw the battle god's son standing not far in front of him. He was looking at him with an indescribable gaze. That gaze was filled with inquiry, disbelief, a very strange realization, and a kind of vigilance. But no matter how deep Luo Fan looked, he just did not see any hostility. Battle god son doesn't seem to hate me. Why is that? At Luo Fan's current level, facing a cultivator that he was not afraid of, he naturally said what he thought and directly asked about his doubts. Normally, after being restrained by a cultivator for nearly 100 years, being forced to challenge a self that seemed impossible to defeat, that kind of experience would definitely make people hate him. But none of this happened to the battle god's son. Looking at the appearance of the war god's son, it was as if the dangerous encounter of nearly 100 years before did not exist at all. How could Luo Fan not be surprised? Battle god's son looked at Luo Fan, who had raised his hand and summoned the three-dimensional talisman to his side. He sighed and said, "Enmity? Why hatred? Fighting is the way I cultivate. It's my life. You didn't kill me. You only gave me a short battle of less than 100 years. Why should I hate you?" The battle god's son asked. This caused Luo Fan to be slightly taken aback. Then he chuckled and said, "So that's how it is. I'm still lacking." He now understood that although the battle god's son had changed his name, but in essence he was still the battle maniac from before. He was still a battle maniac, and he didn't become someone else just because he changed his name. When I was fighting, I planned to draw a line with you as soon as possible and never have anything to do with you. But after thinking about it, I realized that it wasn't a good choice. The battle god's son looked at Luo Fan's smiling face. He sighed again. "Can I ask why exactly?" Luo Fan was taken aback once again and asked. Although he was confident in his strength, he didn't think that he was strong enough to make the battle god's son afraid. The battle god's son wanted to draw a line with him and never have anything to do with him. It was obviously not because he was afraid of him. If he wasn't afraid of him, then what was the reason? Your origin is very mysterious. It's so mysterious that it makes me afraid. The battle god's son looked at Luo Fan and said in a strange tone. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He thought to himself, did the battle god's son know that I still have a body in the untainted land, a doppelganger in the great Tianyuan world, and a body in the Dharma-ending age on Earth? However, this thought only flashed through his mind for a moment. Soon, he knew that it was absolutely impossible. This kind of thing, only sages had a slight chance of seeing it. How could other cultivators who were not sages transcend time and see everything about him? Based on this consideration, Luo Fan's complexion didn't change. He just slightly smiled and said, "Is that so? I don't know what's so mysterious about my background." The battle god's son kept staring at Luo Fan, paying attention to the change in his expression. Fortunately, Luo Fan had concealed the change in his mind very well. Therefore, the battle god's son didn't see any abnormality in him. A flash of understanding appeared in his eyes. He said, "Perhaps even you don't realize your mysteriousness. Let's not talk about mysteriousness." Since the battle god Sun said so, why do you feel that this is not a good choice now? Luo Fan said with a smile. Because I suddenly realized that if your mysteriousness has nothing to do with me, then no matter whether I draw a line with you or not, it must have nothing to do with me. But if your mysteriousness has something to do with me, then no matter how hard I try, it must have something to do with me. The battle god Sun raised his head and looked at the sky. The battle god Sun was a disciple of a sage. He had been sealed in the eye of the sea by a sage for millions of years. In this world, the one who had the most understanding of the power of a sage was probably him. Other cultivators might only have an omnipotent impression of the sage's magical powers. However, he had personally experienced the suppression of a sage and felt the power of a sage. That kind of power, that kind of terror, that kind of irresistible power really made him feel despair. Under this kind of understanding, he just understood that if Luo Fan was really a disciple of a sage, then it was a hidden scheme of a certain sage. Then no matter what he did, it would not have any effect on the result. If that sage had schemed against him, then it would be impossible for him to avoid it. If the sage hadn't schemed against him, then no matter what he did, he wouldn't have been able to escape. It would not have any effect on him. Since no matter what he did, it would not have any effect on the result, then why did he need to draw a line with Luo Fan in a hurry? Why did he need to restrict his actions and suppress his feelings? Luo Fan listened to the battle god Sun. He faintly had some thoughts in his mind. He felt that the surrounding air seemed to have become much heavier. His mind was somewhat heavy. For a moment, both Luo Fan and the battle god Sun fell into silence. The scene became somewhat strange. Luo Fan stood there with a dazed expression. He also raised his head to look at the sky. His eyes were somewhat dazed. There seemed to be countless thoughts flashing between his mind and mind. It also seemed like there were no thoughts at all. It was a blank space. He even faintly felt as if there was a boundless net that enveloped everything in the world, causing all the living beings in the world to be unable to act on their own like puppets. After a while, Luo Fan suddenly came to a realization. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Why are you thinking so much? No matter what the reason for my appearance is, what purpose I have, or what schemes I have behind my back, to me, my cultivation realm has improved. To be able to take a look at the legendary Primordial Tao fruit, that is the greatest harvest. That is the greatest benefit. What does the other things matter? Even if it is like what the battle god Sun thinks. What kind of existence is standing behind me? How will it affect me? Even if it is the worst. So what if I abandon this doppelganger? If it is not enough to abandon this doppelganger, then so what if I abandon my main body in this universe? As long as my main body in the primordial world can attain the primordial Tao fruit, then all problems will no longer be a problem. This main body and doppelganger that have been abandoned and destroyed can also be restored. In that case, what do I have to worry about? As Luo Fan thought about this, the aura on his body became more and more harmonious. The cultivation realm that he had just broken through completely stabilized in an instant. There was even a faint improvement. Stimulated by the aura on Luo Fan's body, the battle god's Sun came back to his senses. When he sensed the increasingly harmonious aura on Luo Fan's body, he could not help but show a look of envy. I didn't expect you to be so brilliant. You actually increased your cultivation realm in such a short time. I really admire you. The battle god Sun sighed. When he looked at him, his eyes were no longer as desolate as before. Clearly, he had also made a decision. I see that it seems a little awkward for you to live on this Chelan cliff. If you don't mind, why don't you come to my victorious battle palace? After congratulating Luo Fan, the battle god Sun directly invited him. From this invitation, one could know what his decision was. When Luo Fan heard this, he did not think for long. He smiled and said, "If that's the case, then I'll have to trouble you. Fellow Taoist, the scenery of your Tao arena must be astonishing." When the battle god's Sun heard Luo Fan's words, he could not help but laugh and said, "It is indeed a good scenery. However, it is different from what you think. You will know when you see it." Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but be interested in the scenery of the victorious battle palace. The battle god Sun casually waved his hand, and the rod in his hand disappeared. Then, a golden cloud appeared under his feet and directly supported him and Luo Fan. Then, the golden cloud slightly trembled and directly broke through the void. It turned into a ray of golden light and shot into the distance. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace. During this entire process, the two of them did not care about Master Ashenwood and Wu Daozi, who were being suppressed here, nor did they care about the cultivators on the Qilin Cliff. It was as if they did not exist at all. The ancestral Taoist had been like a turtle in its shell for the past 100 years. Although he controlled a small portion of the authority on the Qilin Cliff, he did not even dare to give Wu Daozi anything to eat. Only after Luo Fan and the battle god Sun turned into a ray of golden light and left did the ancestral Taoist carefully teleport to where Wu Daozi was suppressed. He bowed to Wu Daozi in shame and said, "Junior is too weak and cannot help Senior. I have no face to face Senior." Wu Daozi frowned and said, "You don't need to say anything. Go take out my Dao Comprehension Hut and Dao Comprehension Mat and build them between me and fellow Ashenwood Master." Wu Daochild frowned. The ancestral Taoist was in a difficult position. "I don't know where Senior's Enlightenment Mat and Enlightenment Hut are." The ancestral Taoist might be on the Qilin Cliff, but they were hidden very deeply. They were in a completely different space and time from where the cultivators were. Under these circumstances, how could the ancestral Taoist, who controlled a very small portion of the authority on the Qilin Cliff, know where to place the Enlightenment Mat and Enlightenment Hut? Come closer. Although Wu Daozi was a little unwilling. He still said, "The suppressive power of the battle god Sun's rod shadow was extremely shocking. Even the authority between him and the Qilin Cliff was completely suppressed, making it impossible for him to use the power of the Qilin Cliff to do anything. As for his own strength, it was completely suppressed by the shadow of the staff. He couldn't even move an inch. He couldn't use the power to do anything. As for the Enlightenment Praying Cushion and Enlightenment Cottage, he only needed to think about it and circulate his power slightly, and he would be able to summon the Enlightenment Praying Cushion and Enlightenment Cottage. But now he could only rely on the ancestral Taoist, who had a bit of authority over the Qilin Cliff, to do these things. This feeling of powerlessness was something that Wu Daozi hadn't felt for many years. For a moment, this feeling of suffocation and discomfort made him extremely depressed. The ancestral Taoist heard Wu Daozi's words. He couldn't help but be overjoyed and quickly whispered into his ear. Wu Daozi spat out a mantra and passed a strange technique to the ancestral Taoist through word of mouth. The ancestral Taoist listened to Wu Daozi and smiled. His expression was one of confusion, one of joy, and one of enlightenment. The efficiency of passing things by word of mouth was extremely low. Even Wu Daozi, who was already at the peak of the quasi-sage realm, was no exception. Back when he could still use his cultivation base, he would only need to point a finger, or even not even a finger, to complete the process of imparting the technique with just a thought. But now he did indeed spend 3 days and 3 nights. Just now, the ancestral Taoist was barely able to complete the process of passing the technique. When he said the last word, the ancestral Taoist bowed to Wu Daozi and said, "Thank you, Senior, for passing the technique. Senior's great kindness. The ancestral Taoist will remember it and never forget it. Don't talk nonsense. Quickly take out the Enlightenment Hut and Enlightenment Mat according to the technique." Wu Daozi frowned and said, "Yes." The ancestral Taoist didn't dare to talk nonsense. He responded and stood up. After standing up, his eyes were solemn and his aura gradually rose. His entire person seemed to be one with the Qilin Cliff. It was as if the ancestral Taoist was no longer the ancestral Taoist, but a part of the Qilin Cliff. He had become an indispensable living being. Then he shouted. Power surged out of his body and formed countless complicated runes in the void. These runes kept sinking in the void, merging and combining. Finally, after 2 hours, when a number of runes had increased to hundreds of billions, all of them formed a huge key. Although this key was formed by runes, it seemed very real. It was shining with golden light, as if it was a key made of gold. It floated in the void and naturally gave off a feeling that it could break through everything. At this moment, the ancestral Taoist's face was pale and his body was trembling slightly. There was even a faint white mist from his evaporated sweat that floated out of his body. However, even though he looked so wretched, the ancestral Taoist's eyes were still shining brightly. They seemed to be 100 times brighter than before. Seeing the key take shape, he shouted, "Open!" With this shout, starting from the very front, the key turned into nothingness bit by bit. It looked like it was gradually disappearing into another space. Then, when half of the key disappeared, the ancestral Taoist held the key with both hands and began to turn it slowly. As he moved his hands in the air, a buzzing sound came from the void. This sound became louder and more obvious. When it reached the final stage, when all the sounds connected into one, the key suddenly disappeared. The void split open and a door of nothingness appeared. After the door appeared, a straw hut appeared on the Chelan cliff. Then, another 2 praying mats fell from the door and directly landed in front of the straw hut. After doing all this, the ancestral Taoist spat out a large mouthful of blood and his entire body withered. The door of nothingness closed in an instant, and the key reappeared in the void. It directly collapsed into countless runes, which then collapsed into endless power that surged into the ancestral Taoist body. Obviously, the previous series of actions was still a little overburdened for the ancestral Taoist. His current withered state and a mouthful of blood was the price he had to pay for overusing the technique. Chapter 10:51. At this moment, Wu Daozi was no longer in the mood to care about Taoist Chuan. With a thought, the Tao Comprehension Hut landed between him and Master Tsang Muzi. Then the 2 meditation mats separated. One flew toward Master Tsang Muzi, and the other flew toward him. Master Ashenwood, the Tao Comprehension Hut, and the Tao Comprehension Hut can create an aura that far surpasses the peak of the quasi-sage realm. This aura not only allows one to better comprehend Tao, but it also has the effect of weakening all seals. Battle Godchild suppression should also be weakened. Wu Daozi used the effect of the Tao Comprehension Hut to transmit his voice to Master Ashenwood. Master Ashenwood's expression was a bit weak, but when he heard this voice, his eyes lit up. He nodded toward Wu Daozi and placed his hand on the Tao Comprehension Hut. In that instant, a mysterious aura surged into his body through the enlightenment mat, causing his mind to become extremely clear. He felt that everything in front of him had become extremely clear. Even the huge rod shadow that was constantly suppressing him seemed to have lightened a lot at this moment, making him feel relaxed, which was rare for him after more than 100 years of suppression. When this feeling appeared, how could Master Ashen would not understand that Wu Daozi's words were not false? He quickly closed his eyes and tried to sense this aura, allowing it to fill his body even more. This connection was even more comprehensive. Different from the Chelan Cliff, the Tao Comprehension Hut were treasures that he had refined himself. They had already become one with his mind. This connection was extremely difficult to sever. Even the shadow of the Battle Godson's rod could not cut off his connection with the Chelan Cliff. Thus, even though Wu Daozi couldn't use his own power or communicate with the Chelan Cliff, he could still freely control the Tao Comprehension Hut and the Tao Comprehension Hut. It was also because of this that he was able to control the Tao Comprehension Hut to a certain location. He could control the Tao Comprehension Hut and the Tao Comprehension Hut and the Tao Comprehension Hut. Through the Tao Comprehension Hut, he sensed that Master Ashenwood was using the Tao Comprehension Hut and the Tao Comprehension Hut to help him resist the pressure of the rod shadow. He also raised his hand and pressed it on the enlightenment futon. The energy within the praying mat began to flow into his body. It began to weaken the suppressive power of the rod shadow. The aura coming from enlightenment futon was the result of the interaction between the enlightenment futon and the enlightenment cottage. It could be said that it was a method that could be inherited from the sage's ability. Even though the main function of this aura wasn't to weaken the power of the seal, due to its powerful nature, the weakening effect was considerable. according to Wu Dao Zi's calculations. Originally, this rod shadow could suppress him for 9 million years. But now that he had the help of this aura, this kind of suppression effect could probably be weakened by as much as 80%. In other words, it could only suppress him for 1 million years at most. Being suppressed for such a long time was an extremely unbearable thing for Wu Daozi. But compared to the original 9 million years of suppression, this was already a huge improvement. Battle God's son, wait for me to come out. I will definitely teach you a lesson. Wu Daozi swore. However, he could only be ruthless. A random rod shadow that was thrown out by the Do Godson was able to suppress him for 9 million years. This kind of strength was something that the Do Godson could not compare with. Even if he could escape from this oppression after 1 million years, his strength would definitely be inferior to the Do Godson. In this kind of situation, even if he wanted to get revenge, he would not have the ability. Therefore, what else could he do other than being ruthless? He slowly closed his eyes and quietly mobilized the aura. His entire body lay there as his expression gradually calmed down. He was like a statue. The place where the two rod shadows were located fell into a state of silence. After a long while, Patriarch Chuan let out a long sigh and slowly rose to his feet. His face was filled with excitement and satisfaction. I didn't expect there to be such an exquisite technique. It was the right decision to travel through time and space to come here. Sect leader Chuan thought to himself. Over the past 3 days and 3 nights, the technique that Wu Daozi had taught him was only a technique to open up the deep layers of space in Qilin Cliff. It had only one function, and it was extremely costly. If he were to use it in battle, it would be like using tofu to fight. It was ridiculous. However, this magic art was extremely exquisite. It contained the supreme mysteries of peak Sage to Be and even some mysteries beyond peak Sage to Be level. If Mo Wuji could study this magic art thoroughly and understand all the principles behind it, it would not be impossible for him to break through to the pinnacle of the Sage to Be peak Sage to Be. It was easy to imagine how important and precious such an exquisite technique was to the Taoist sect inheritor. To be able to obtain such a discovery, it was just that he had to pay a huge price, suffer some minor injuries, and be dispirited for a while. What did that count for? Taoist Chuanzong was very excited and was very grateful to Wu Daozi. Now that Senior is suppressed, no one will care about that matter. I have to take on the task of guiding him like before. I can't let you down, Senior, Taoist Chuan thought to himself. After he made up his mind, he bowed to Wu Daozi and said, "Don't worry, Senior. I've received such a great favor from Senior, so I'll definitely not let Senior down. I'll definitely protect Qilin Cliff during these days when it's inconvenient for Senior and make everything on Qilin Cliff go smoothly." Wu Daozi was now wholeheartedly guiding the aura from the enlightenment cushion to help him offset the power of suppression. How could he have the time to care about sect leader Chuan? However, he did not care at all. His eyes were still closed, and he still looked like a statue. Sect leader Chuan knew that Wu Daozi had no time to care about him, so he bowed again. He turned around and took a step forward, arriving at the edge of Qilin Cliff. He sat down cross-legged in front of the sea of clouds with more than 100 million air vortexes. In the past 100 years, coincidentally, there were no newcomers. Otherwise, there would have been some changes. Even if it wasn't a big deal for Wu Daozi, it would be a little troublesome for the Chuan Taoist. After all, Wu Daozi did not have time to care about anything else. He could only focus on resisting the power of suppression. Sect leader Chuan was the one who really cared about the situation on Qilin Cliff. If those newcomers were not guided, they would cause chaos on Qilin Cliff. My strength is only at the peak of great accomplishment quasi-sage. I am still far from the peak of great accomplishment quasi-sage. If that newcomer is a peak of quasi-sage, I am afraid it will be troublesome. Sect leader Chuan looked at the whirlpools in front of him. He felt an indescribable worry in his heart. He was worried. His gaze swept around. He found that many cultivators on Qilin Cliff looked calm. They looked at him with an indescribable charm. They seemed to be gloating and admiring at the same time. There seemed to be some hatred in their eyes. In the cultivation world above Chelan Cliff, there weren't many peak quasi-sages, only a handful of them. That was to say, for the ancestral priest who had some authority in Chelan Cliff, the only people on the Chelan Cliff who could not be subdued were the few peak sages to be. The other hundreds of thousands of cultivators were just a piece of cake for the Taoist patriarch to suppress. As for those peak sage to be, after witnessing such a battle, they naturally understood the huge gap between them and Wu Daozi. They knew that if they escaped now, after millions of years, when Wu Daozi escaped, what awaited them would be death. Obviously, for a peak sage to be, millions of years was no different from a nap. Paying such a heavy price for the freedom to take a nap was obviously not something that these self-proclaimed wise cultivators were willing to do. Because of this, even though it seemed to be the best time for them to escape from Chelan Cliff and obtain freedom, none of them left this place. He was still cultivating on the Chelan Cliff like he had done in the past. Perhaps they were even enjoying it. After all, Chelan Cliff was Wu Daozi's place of cultivation and the place where he cultivated. Its cultivation environment was naturally hard to find in the world. Being able to cultivate here was also a rare opportunity for cultivators who were dedicated to cultivation. Apart from these peak of quasi-sages, even if the other peak of quasi-sages wanted to escape, they could not defeat sect leader Chuan. Therefore, they could only continue to live like before. The ancestral Taoist swept his gaze across the crowd. With a glance, he knew that it would not be a problem to stop the cultivators from causing trouble, but it was impossible to get them to help him suppress the newcomers that he could not suppress. How detestable! These people have occupied such a wonderful holy land for cultivation, but they actually don't have the slightest bit of gratitude. They even keep thinking of fleeing as if this is some dangerous place. Humph! Patriarch Chuan was infuriated by their attitude. In his anger, he looked away from the cultivators and suddenly saw a cultivator who was busy on Chelan Cliff. It was the peak of quasi-sage who had been suppressed by Wu Daozi and turned into a puppet. He was the first person that he could not suppress, the central sacred master. How could I forget about him? He is now suppressed by Senior. I am the person with the highest authority in Chelan Cliff. Perhaps I can order him. With his help, even peak sage-to-be newbies won't be able to resist. Chuan's own Taoist thought as he sent an order to the Central Sage Lord. The Central Sacred Lord was in the middle of building a new cave abode. Upon receiving this order, his body suddenly froze, and he turned his head to look at Chuan Taoist with a numb and indifferent gaze. Then, he continued to build the cave abode. Although sect leader Chuan did not completely order the Central Sacred Master, he was not disappointed. Instead, he was very happy. The fact that the Central Sacred Master responded to his order naturally meant that he could order the Central Sacred Master. The only difference was the extent of the order. Sect leader Chuan thought that the Central Sacred Master did not carry out his order because it was beyond his authority. With this thought in mind, Chuanzong's expression relaxed. Since Wu Daozi was able to give him a certain level of control over the Central Sacred Master. Thinking about it, it was also because he did not have enough strength to completely suppress all the rookies. So his authority allowed him to at least suppress those rookies. That was enough. He didn't need the help of the Central Holy Master for anything else. After understanding this, sect leader Chuan did not care about anything else. He sat down cross-legged at the edge of Chelan Cliff and closed his eyes to study the magic art that Wu Daozi had imparted to him. Although he had used the same technique before, it was just a copy of what he had done. In fact, his own understanding of this magic art was still extremely lacking. If he wanted to gain more benefits from this magic art, he would have to do so. In order to comprehend more, he would need to put in a lot of effort to research and comprehend. As he began to study the technique, an indescribable aura gradually rippled from his body. This aura was so subtle, so mysterious. Between the ripples, it faintly merged with the entire Chelan Cliff. There seemed to be all sorts of unimaginable existences on the Chelan Cliff that poured into his body through this aura. For Luo Fan, the changes on the Chelan Cliff were meaningless. For the time being, it was meaningless. After leaving Chelan Cliff on a golden cloud with the battle god sun, they had traveled for billions of miles. Suddenly, they realized that the sea of clouds below them was gradually thinning. Following this, an invisible barrier appeared in front of them. This invisible barrier contained the profundities of time and space. It was a space-time barrier that separated two spaces. This is the barrier between the Chelan Cliff Training Hall and the heaven and earth. The battle god sun explained to Luo Fan. This barrier cannot be sensed unless you personally come here. Daoist friend, you have never left Chelan Cliff, so you must be very unfamiliar with this place. As he spoke, the battle god sun stopped the cloud in front of the barrier. Obviously, he wanted to give Luo Fan a chance to better observe the barrier and feel the mysteries of the barrier. It's really mysterious. Not only can it separate two spaces, but it can also sense things beyond one's perception. This technique is really exquisite. It shouldn't be the technique of a peak sage-to-be. Luo Fan carefully observed the barrier with the perspective of a town master. He found that the barrier was almost easy. There seemed to be no more subtle differences inside. Obviously, the mysteries of the barrier were beyond his perception. The location of our training hall was given by our master. It is the technique of a sage. If we can understand the mysteries inside, we will have the opportunity to become a sage. Unfortunately, since ancient times, countless disciples of the sages have been given training halls by the sages. However, none of them have really gained anything from it. The battle god sun said with some emotion, "Training halls given by the sages?" Luo Fan was stunned, and then he understood. This was very normal. When he accepted disciples, he would occasionally bestow some cave abodes to his disciples. For a sage, after accepting a cultivator as a disciple, he would bestow some Tao grounds to him. This was a matter of course. However, although the Chelan Cliff is wonderful, it seems to be far from this barrier. Luo Fan said with a frown, "Haha, you misunderstood. The space-time where this dojo is located was bestowed by the saint. However, the items within, including this Chelan Cliff and my dojo, the victorious battle palace, were all created by us. Naturally, they are far inferior to this barrier." The battle god's son chuckled. "I see." Luo Fan also smiled when he heard this. After the two stayed here for a while, the battle god's son urged the cloud to turn into a golden light and rushed into the barrier in front of them. In an instant, Luo Fan felt as if he had passed through an unknown number of layers of space-time from the depths of his mind. After a while, his surroundings cleared up, and he discovered that he was in a boundless world. Below him was a boundless sea of clouds. Below the sea of clouds was a boundless world. The 10 suns in the sky looked no different from the ones he had seen before. Taking a deep breath, he felt that the surrounding Yuan Qi was hundreds of times thinner than before. Although it was still tens of thousands of times denser than it was in the Age of Chaos, it was still far from what it used to be. "Is this the real world?" Luo Fan murmured. He turned around to look behind him, only to find an endless void. There was no barrier, no trace of the existence of the Chelan Cliff. "Yes, this place is already outside of Wu Daozi's dojo." Do Shenzi laughed. He suddenly patted his head and said, "I almost forgot." As he spoke, he raised his hand, and thousands of runes condensed into a strange talisman. It was sent to Luo Fan. "This is the proof to enter the training halls given by the sages. Without this proof, even I would not be able to find the locations of the training halls. Proof of entry into the various dojos. This item must be very precious. If you give me the proof to enter the Battle God Palace, I will naturally welcome it. However, wouldn't it be inappropriate to use it with the proof to enter the other training halls? Would the other sages be dissatisfied?" Luo Fan looked at the talisman and frowned. Chapter 1052. Since the Battle God Sun had already said so, Luo Fan naturally would not decline. After expressing his gratitude, he took the talisman. This talisman was in the shape of a cardboard card, and there were countless fine and dense runes drawn on it. In the end, it formed an extremely complicated certificate. As he held the talisman, Luo Fan felt an indescribable aura surging out from the talisman and directly pouring into his body. Within this aura, he could only feel an endless amount of mysterious information flowing into his mind and mind. These were the complex changes of countless spacetimes. These oblique changes were caused by millions of factors at the same time. There seemed to be no pattern between the changes, which confused Luo Fan. However, after the final change, dozens of spacetimes appeared in Luo Fan's mind. These spacetimes were labeled with names, including the Buddhist Pure Land, the Victorious Battle Palace, the Nviwa Palace, and the Chelan Cliff. Clearly, these spacetimes were the locations of the dojos bestowed by the sages. After receiving this information, Luo Fan's eyes slightly changed, and his point of view changed slightly. When he looked back, he found that a boundless void had appeared behind him. The void was filled with yuan qi that was hundreds of times denser than where he was currently. Within the boundless yuan qi, there was a huge continent floating in the void. Under the huge continent was a boundless sea of clouds, and between the clouds were over 100 million strange vortexes. This was obviously Wu Daozi's dojo, the Chelan Cliff. I see. Looks like I do need the proof. Without it, I won't be able to remember the location of the Chelan Cliff, even if I enter it 1,000,000 times. Luo Fan sighed. He slowly returned his perspective to normal. When he looked again, the void had completely returned to normal, and the Chelan Cliff had completely disappeared. It was as if it had never appeared. What would the dojos bestowed by the sages look like if they didn't have such mysteries? Battle God's son chuckled. Luo Fan nodded in agreement. He raised his hand and put the proof into his heaven and earth in his sleeve. It also completely expelled the aura that had invaded his body and was continuously pouring information into his body. After doing all of this, his mind moved slightly. His perspective changed slightly, and he looked back again. He found that the void was still there. The Chelan Cliff had not appeared at all. It was as if the void was purely empty. There was no strange existence here. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that his guess was correct. These Taoist grounds that were bestowed by the sages were constantly undergoing some kind of complicated, almost irregular changes. Those changes corresponded to the information within the proof. Anyone at the peak of the sage-to-be would not be able to understand the changes. If he wanted to enter, he could only rely on the information within the certificate to guide him. If he didn't have the guidance of that information, it would be impossible for him to find the location of the dojo at this moment. Without the guidance of the information, they would not be able to understand the changes. The Battle God's son also nodded with a smile and said, "That's why I'm pursuing becoming a saint." Luo Fan nodded with a smile. Then, the Battle God's son urged the auspicious cloud under his feet. He directly turned into a golden light and shot out to a certain place in the void. This time, he did not restrict his speed like he did in the Chelan Cliff dojo. Instead, he directly pushed his speed to the limit without any reservation. This speed was like moving through space and time. In the blink of an eye, he was hundreds of millions of miles away. Although he turned into a golden light in the void, it flashed and disappeared. He could only leave a faint shadow in the void. No one could see this golden light clearly. At this speed, Luo Fan and the Battle God's son flew for a full 2 hours. Just then, they stopped in a void that Luo Fan was completely unfamiliar with. This place was hundreds of millions of miles away from the Chelan Cliff dojo. In terms of light years, it would be tens of billions of light years away. The speed at which he flew was so fast that it had reached an unimaginable level. However, during the entire process, Luo Fan only felt as if he had stopped moving. He did not feel like he was flying at all, nor did he feel any discomfort due to the excessive speed. It was obvious that the Battle God's son's flying ability was exquisite and not something an ordinary cultivator could compare with. This is Fellow's dojo. Luo Fan saw that the auspicious cloud had stopped and had a guess in his heart. Yes. The Battle God's son could not help but smile when he saw that Luo Fan did not take out the proof. He was quite satisfied with Luo Fan's performance. Normally, when a cultivator obtained a certificate, they would take it out and look at it from time to time. If they could use it, they would take it out and use it. However, Luo Fan did not seem to care about the proof at all. He allowed the battle god sun to bring him to a completely unfamiliar place. This was clearly a kind of inexplicable trust, but the battle god sun was quite satisfied. This was the dojo of the battle god sun. He had already completely refined it. Under such circumstances, the battle god sun did not need a certificate to enter and exit the dojo like the dojo of the other sages. The dojo had already become one with his mind. No matter where he went, it would definitely have an extremely close connection with him. This kind of close connection allowed him to easily find its existence. Why would he need any proof? After stopping the auspicious cloud in the void, the battle god sun raised his hand and pointed forward. Countless strange lines flashed in the void and finally formed a huge door in front of them. After the door appeared, endless golden light seeped out. The golden light was not noble or rich. Instead, it was filled with an endless fighting spirit and battle intent. The fighting spirit and battle intent were so strong that it was unimaginable. Even Luo Fan was affected by the golden light. An inexplicable feeling of hot-bloodedness arose from the bottom of his heart. Under such a hot-blooded feeling, Luo Fan even had the thought of fighting with someone. I haven't been here for thousands of years. I'm a little curious about the changes in the dojo now. The battle god sun took a deep breath. He seemed to be enjoying the feeling of being illuminated by the golden light. The fighting spirit in the golden light. Although the fighting spirit was extremely strong, it was not overbearing. It was extremely easy for Luo Fan to cut off its influence. With a slight thought, his mind had completely returned to normal. He was no longer affected by the golden light. Hearing the battle god's son's words, he could not help but smile. I heard that you have been suppressed by the sages in the eye of the sea for thousands of years. I wonder why? If this was between ordinary people, it would naturally be an act of exposing scars. It would definitely cause unhappiness between the two of them. However, for existences like Luo Fan and the battle god sun, but none of this counted for much. For existences like them, all the difficulties, humiliation, and setbacks they had suffered in the past had become experience. They had become a driving force for the advancement of their cultivation. Even if others knew about it, it was nothing. Under such circumstances, for cultivators of this level, there was naturally nothing that could not be said. In the eyes of cultivators of this level, Luo Fan's question was equivalent to asking about his past cultivation experience. How could it be considered anything? Sure enough, the battle god sun heard Luo Fan's words and chuckled. It's nothing. I just went to Master's dojo on a whim and made a bet with him. Speaking of this, Luo Fan could not help but become even more curious. Make a bet? How could a bet cause such serious consequences? Oh, what kind of bet? Luo Fan asked curiously. Back then, I really couldn't find an opponent, so I made a bet with Master. I asked Master to limit his strength to 1 in 3 quadrillion and not use the divine abilities of Saint. He suppressed his cultivation level to the same level as mine and accepted my challenge. If I could defeat Master, Master would not pursue the matter. If I lost, Master would suppress me in the eye of the sea. If I lost, Master would suppress me in the eye of the sea. The longer I lose, the longer I am suppressed. The battle god sun said with an indescribable expression in his eyes. The indescribable expression in his eyes seemed to contain a kind of reminiscence, a kind of shock, a kind of pride, and a kind of disbelief. At this moment, Luo Fan looked at the battle god sun with an indescribable shock in his eyes. Challenging a sage, such a terrifying decision was something that even he could not imagine. Luo Fan did not worship the sages like the cultivators of this world. He did not think that the sages would not make any mistakes. He did not think that everything in the world was in the hands of the sages. Of course, he was not being arrogant. It was because he had already seen the result of the sages' mistakes in the future. However, even if he did not worship the sages, he had to admit that the power of the sages was beyond his imagination. He had to admit that the sages were omnipotent. The battle god sun's many restrictions on the sages, such as limiting his strength to 1 in 3 trillion, not using the sage's abilities, and suppressing his cultivation level to the peak of a quasi-sage, He did not think that this would have much of an impact on the sages. He also did not think that the sages would be suppressed by such restrictions. No peak quasi-sage could compare to the sages. Under such circumstances, the battle god's son actually dared to challenge the sages. This kind of courage was hard to believe, and he could not help but feel shocked. What was the result? With all these thoughts in mind, Luo Fan suddenly felt that his throat was a little dry. Result: the battle god son smiled bitterly and said, "Do I still need to say the result? I was suppressed for 10 million years. Isn't that the result? I am asking, under such restrictions, how long did you last?" Luo Fan continued to ask. "I don't know." The battle godson gave an answer that surprised Luo Fan. "How can you not know? How long have you been fighting? How can you not know how long have you been fighting?" Luo Fan frowned once again. "Originally, I thought that I lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. However, after being suppressed for these years, the more I thought about it, the more I felt that there was something wrong. In the end, I even felt that the moment I started to attack, the battle was already over." The battle god's son sighed. At this point, the battle god's son's eyes even had a faint look of confusion. After listening to the battle god's son's words, Luo Fan could not help but fall into silence. He originally wanted to guess the situation of the battle from the battle god's son's answer, and guess what the sages had up their sleeves. Now, he realized that no matter how he thought about it, he could not remember what it was like back then. His strength was suppressed, his cultivation state was suppressed, and he couldn't use the sage's magical powers. After such suppression, there shouldn't be anything that the battle god's son couldn't understand. However, under such circumstances, the battle god's son didn't even know how long he had been fighting. How was this something that he could understand? After thinking for a while, Luo Fan smiled bitterly and sighed. "The sage's abilities are indeed mysterious. It is not something that I can understand." He, the battle god's son, also smiled bitterly. "Let's not talk about this. Today, I invited you here to admire the scenery of the victorious battle palace, not to talk about this. Please, fellow Taoist." The battle god's son shook his head. The battle god's son said to Luo Fan, "Please." Luo Fan also suppressed his emotions and said with a smile. As they spoke, the two left the magic cloud and flew towards the door. At this point, naturally, there was no need for the battle god's son to ride the magic cloud to carry the two of them. Once they entered the door, the golden light became even more intense and even more dazzling. Within the golden light, there was fighting spirit and the will to fight. It was even more intense. After entering the door, apart from the golden light, there was also a boundless continent. This continent was many times larger than the Chelan Cliff. It was almost as vast as a universe. There were countless mountains, rivers, and plains. There were billions of living beings in it. This is actually a world? Luo Fan looked at the scene in the dojo and couldn't help but be surprised. A dojo like this was naturally excellent for nurturing living beings. However, cultivating in this place was not a good thing. Usually, with so much mortal aura filling the dojo, no matter how dense the yuan qi was, it would not be very beneficial for cultivation. A dojo like this was the victorious battle palace. How could Luo Fan not be surprised? The battle god's son looked at Luo Fan and chuckled. "What I cultivate is the battle Tao. It is not the battle Tao. This kind of Tao requires the fighting of living beings. It requires the will of countless living beings. I need a dojo like this to be beneficial for my cultivation. So that's how it is." Luo Fan listened to the battle god son's explanation and looked at the boundless continent. He couldn't help but be surprised. There were countless living beings on this continent. Every living being's strength was only at the level of an ordinary mortal. However, they didn't seem to have a lifespan limit. All of them were full of vitality and were neither dead nor alive. They lived by fighting and became stronger because of it. They were fighting almost all the time. Their rest was fighting. Eating was fighting. Falling in love was fighting. Even reproducing was fighting. For all the living beings in this dojo, fighting was as normal as breathing. Because of this normalcy, this world of the dojo didn't become chaotic because of the fighting. The living beings didn't become cruel, evil, or chaotic because of it. If the characteristics of fighting were removed, this world was no different from a normal world. There was still good and evil, virtuous and foolish. Similarly, there were all kinds of gratitude and hatred, all kinds of conflicts of interest, and all kinds of tragic events. Such a world indeed contained endless profundities, allowing people to comprehend the true meaning of battle, allowing people to have a deeper comprehension and understanding of the battle Tao. From this point of view, this dojo was indeed the most suitable for the battle god Sun, who cultivated the battle Tao. Especially when the battle god Sun was still called the battle god Sun, this dojo was even more suitable for him. Apart from you, none of the people who have come to the victorious battle palace admit that this is also a kind of cultivation. They all think that I'm just playing around and venting my desire to fight. The battle god Sun couldn't help but be overjoyed when he saw the sincerity in Luo Fan's eyes. I've gone through the path of transcendence. Oh, it's also the path of great accomplishment. I've seen more than 9,000 eras there. I've seen almost all kinds of eras. Of course, I won't be deceived by appearances. Luo Fan chuckled. The path of transcendence was a name he came up with based on the fact that not only could one transcend time and arrive at this unbroken world billions of years ago, but it could also allow a cultivator to reach the transcendence realm. According to the division of cultivation realms in this world, this path could allow a person to reach the great accomplishment quasi-sage realm. Naturally, it should be called the path of great accomplishment. Because of this, Luo Fan changed his word halfway. The path of transcendence? The path of great accomplishment? The battle god Sun was confused. However, he quickly reacted and said, "So, fellow Taoist is talking about the space-time path that connects the present and the future. I wonder what you experienced on that path. I've often heard of such a path, but no one has ever told me what it looks like. So you guys call it the path of time? This name doesn't seem very appropriate. Plus, it feels a little generic. It's not as good as the path of great accomplishment or the path of transcendence." Upon hearing this, Luo Fan didn't immediately answer the battle god Sun's question. Instead, he first explained the battle god Sun's clumsy name for the path of transcendence. Chapter 1053. Luo Fan looked at him and knew that the battle god Sun had come up with the name of the path of time and space. He didn't say anything else and just smiled. Then he told the battle god Sun about his experiences on the path of transcendence without hiding anything. These experiences might have been very important to him back then, but it was just a small matter to him now. The various mysteries and gains within were all things that he could understand with a single glance at the current him. They were like chapters in a novel. This was the case for him, and it was even more so for the battle god Sun, who was much stronger than him. If that was the case, why would he need to hide these experiences? The battle god Sun couldn't help but be shocked when he heard Luo Fan's narration. I didn't expect that the small, great accomplishment path would be so mysterious. If I had known, I would have been thick-skinned and tried it, the battle god Sun said helplessly. This path is not a path that can be reversed. It's possible to travel from a future to this time period, but it's not easy to travel from this time period to the future. At least, with the structure of the vortex at that time, it's not that simple. Luo Fan chuckled. There's always a way. The battle god Sun said disapprovingly. This kind of thinking couldn't be more natural to him. In this world, anything was possible. Anything that seemed impossible could happen as long as the right method was found. The structure of the vortex at that time was irreversible and could only travel from the future to the present. However, since such a path existed, then even if it was irreversible, there should be various methods to reverse it so that cultivators could use this path to reach the future. It was like a waterfall falling from a high place. If an object wanted to pass through this waterfall, it could only be done by going from the top down and following the flow of the waterfall. However, if someone was strong enough to reach an unimaginable level, with sufficient equipment, but it wasn't impossible to climb to the top of the waterfall from the bottom. Luo Fan only chuckled when he heard the battle god Sun's words. Of course, such a concept was not wrong. However, It was obvious that the difficulty of going from the present to the future through the era vortex was not as simple as an ordinary person climbing up a waterfall. What is involved? It was definitely beyond the comprehension of a peak sage to be. Battle God's son wanted to do it. He would probably have to ask his master for help. And apparently, the Battle God's son, who had just been suppressed by his master for thousands of years, was obviously not qualified to ask his master to help him do such a ridiculous thing. Battle God's son was just saying it. Of course, he didn't really think that he could do it just by saying it. At this moment, he brought Luo Fan to a certain location on this boundless continent. There was a nation here, and it was the largest, most vast, most prosperous, and most powerful nation on the continent. The name of this country was Victorious. The ruler of this country was none other than the Battle God's son. Daoist friend established this country. Luo Fan and the Battle God's son came to the top of the royal palace of this country and asked in surprise. It was understandable that he would open up a world in his own dojo that was solely dedicated to combat. However, if he directly threw himself into this world to establish a country and act as the ruler of this country, even if it was a little superficial, his actions were somewhat disregarding of his status. The Battle God's son said proudly, "Of course, you see, this country is not bad. I haven't appeared for thousands of years, but this country is still as powerful as when I left. Moreover, the royal palace is still empty waiting for me. This kind of country can't appear anywhere else, but it has appeared here. This is not a simple matter." That's not the point. The point is, what's the point of doing this? With fellow Taoist ability, you can see through everything in this world with a single glance. You can directly stand high above the void and experience all the changes in this world. Why do you need to establish a country in this world and even act as the king yourself? Don't you think this is fun? In any case, I can experience the changes in this world here, and I can also experience the changes in this world above the void. Why do I have to stay above the void and can't establish a country here? The Battle God's son asked. Luo Fan was a bit stumped by this question. The Battle God's son's words made sense. Since it was the same everywhere, it was the Battle God's son's own choice. I see. I've learned a lot. Thinking about this, Luo Fan could only smile slightly. However, this is Taoist Friend's dojo. This world was created by Taoist Friend. Thus, Taoist Friend is the sky of this world. I previously looked at the customs of this world, and it seems that the ruler is also called the Son of Heaven. If Taoist Friend becomes the ruler like this, wouldn't that mean that you are your own son? I've never thought about it from this angle. The Battle God's son opened his mouth and said hesitantly, "It doesn't matter. In any case, I've been a monarch for hundreds of millions of years. I'll just be my own son." After a while, the Battle God's son bitterly smiled and entered the palace with Luo Fan. As soon as they entered the palace, they didn't know what kind of special change was triggered. Immediately, hundreds of people rushed over and greeted the ruler. Of course, for a world where fighting was everything, even this greeting of the ruler was also a battle. The Battle God's son fought with the ministers, the guards, the palace maids, the concubines. After the battle, the ceremony was completed. Only then did the Battle God's son bring Luo Fan to a pavilion in the Imperial Garden with satisfaction. He dismissed the ministers and said to Luo Fan, "Taoist Friend, you've personally experienced the customs of this country. How do you feel?" Luo Fan smiled slightly. He said, "The scenery is indeed different." Haha, I knew that Taoist Friend wouldn't like this custom. I was right. The Battle God's son laughed. Luo Fan glanced at the Battle God's son and found that he was really happy. He couldn't help but feel helpless. Since he brought Luo Fan to visit his dojo, he naturally had to satisfy Luo Fan. This Battle God's son knew that Luo Fan wouldn't like it, but he still brought Luo Fan here regardless. This isn't the way to treat a guest. Luo Fan sighed. This victorious battle palace is like this. It can only be taken out for Taoist Friend to see. That was all there was to it. Even if Taoist Friend isn't satisfied, there's nothing you can do. The Battle God's son laughed. As he spoke, he raised his hand and wiped the table in front of him. The tea and snacks that were originally placed on the table disappeared without a trace. Then, they disappeared without a trace. What replaced them were some strange fruits that looked extremely precious. There was also a bejeweled nectar that made Luo Fan feel refreshed after smelling it. Although this dojo of the victorious battle palace was extremely mysterious and the living beings inside were immortal, their power was still at the level of mortals. It was quite interesting to enjoy the customs and scenery of this world. However, if one ate the food they prepared, it would be a bit degrading. I don't know how many billions of years it has been since I've satisfied my appetite. Luo Fan looked at the fruits and the bejeweled nectar and couldn't help but sigh. I also don't know how many years it has been since I've eaten anything. The battle god Sun made a gesture of invitation and poured a mouthful of the bejeweled nectar into his mouth. He let out a long sigh and reminisced. Luo Fan smiled and sipped a mouthful of the nectar. He felt the fragrance fill his entire body. Even his soul was immersed in an indescribable delicacy. The taste of the bejeweled nectar was indescribable. After entering the mouth, there was only a delicious feeling. I'm afraid this is the manifestation of the true meaning of deliciousness. I never thought it could be like this. Luo Fan sensed it and praised the battle god Sun. This is a technique created by a disciple of mine who has a great appetite. What I've learned is only the tip of the iceberg. It's a pity that he and I didn't get along very well. Otherwise, I could have shown you what true deliciousness is. The battle god Sun said with some pity, "Everything is indeed profound." Luo Fan sipped another mouthful and said. The battle god's son chuckled and chatted with Luo Fan about the interesting things about this dojo while enjoying the fruit nectar on the table. As they chatted, Luo Fan could clearly feel the battle god's son's feelings for this dojo world. This dojo world wasn't just a place for him to cultivate. He had entrusted a lot of his emotions to it. As soon as he talked about this dojo world, his mood was very calm and he was very happy. This calmness and happiness made him seem like a different person. He didn't look like a battle maniac at all. He didn't look like a powerful cultivator who had comprehended the true meaning of the battle Tao and set foot on the third stage. Instead, he looked like an ordinary mortal who had some worries and ordinary emotions. Or, in other words, an ordinary emperor. As they chatted, Luo Fan also knew why the victorious fighting nation still existed after he left this dojo world for so many years. Moreover, it still recognized him as the monarch. There was no difference from before. The reason was complicated, but it was actually very simple. It was because the battle god Sun used his identity as the ruler of this world to engrave in the subconscious of all living beings in this world that he was the monarch of the victorious fighting nation. The victorious fighting nation was a nation that would never move, never disappear, and never expand. It was the largest and most prosperous nation in the entire world. Because of this, something like this happened. When Luo Fan heard this, he was secretly amused. When he first came here, the battle god Sun was still boasting that his nation still existed after thousands of years, and that he was still the monarch. However, he didn't expect the truth to be exposed by himself in just a few words. Using the method of directly changing the subconscious of living beings to maintain the identity of a monarch was like making a mountain out of a molehill just for the sake of drinking milk. This chat didn't involve any Tao techniques or magical powers. It was just a simple chat about many interesting things. This kind of chat wasn't very useful for the improvement of their cultivation, but it gave them a rare opportunity to relax. Both of them were cultivation maniacs. Needless to say, Luo Fan didn't need to say much. Apart from fighting, it was also cultivation. He hadn't relaxed for hundreds of millions of years until now. The battle god Sun was even more diligent than Luo Fan. Apart from fighting, he was either fighting or being suppressed. He also hadn't relaxed for a very long time. Now that there was such a chance to relax, it was extremely rare for the two of them. This time, I invited you here to let you see the scenery of this dojo, but it's not good to stay here. However, it's not good to stay here forever. Why don't you follow me into the dojo and experience the lifestyle of all living beings here? Battle god Sun suddenly suggested after half a day. Forget it. I don't cultivate the path of battle, so doing this won't do me much good. Luo Fan shook his head. You were born and raised in this world. What do you know about the many interesting places in this world? The battle godson didn't care about Luo Fan's rejection. After hearing the latter's question, he couldn't help but frown and said, Interesting places. I'm afraid this is difficult for me. With our current cultivation level, there are almost no secrets in this world. There are almost no secrets left in this world. Even if it's dangerous, even if it's strange, you can see through it with a glance. If you want to find an interesting place. After thinking for a while, the battle godson's eyes lit up and he said, I got it. There aren't many interesting places in this world, but that's not necessarily the case outside of this world. Outside of this world, Luo Fan couldn't help but be slightly stunned when he heard this. If it was an ordinary big thousand world, medium thousand world, or small thousand world, Luo Fan could easily understand it. But this was a perfect world as powerful and terrifying as the untainted land. Wouldn't the outside of this world be in a state of chaos? This state of chaos was interesting, but the degree of danger was not something that a peak sage-to-be and a Dao master could bear. Thinking of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but look at the battle godson with a strange look. You misunderstood me. I'm not talking about the chaos. No cultivator who hasn't become a sage can regard the existence of the chaos as an interesting place. The battle godson knew what Luo Fan meant when he saw the look in Luo Fan's eyes. He knew that his words were too general and made Luo Fan misunderstand, so he hurriedly explained. Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood and asked, Is there anything other than the chaos outside of this world? You've made me confused. It's not accurate to say that it's outside of this world. The battle godson seemed to be thinking about how to explain to Luo Fan. He spoke very slowly. Luo Fan nodded and gestured for the battle godson to speak slowly. Well, let's put it another way. Is the Taoist field given by the sage in this world? The battle godson asked. Luo Fan instinctively wanted to say yes. But before he could finish his words, he came to a realization. The Taoist field given by the sage really doesn't seem to be in this world. The experience outside the Qilin Cliff and the victorious battle palace flashed through his mind as he thought about it. These Taoist fields, whether it was the victorious battle palace or the Qilin Cliff, all seemed to be in this world. It seemed like they were just small worlds or worlds that had been opened up in the void somewhere in this world. However, when Luo Fan recalled his previous experience, he realized that things might not be as they seemed. If it was really a small world or a small world that had been opened up in the void somewhere in this world, then Luo Fan would definitely be able to find traces of it standing outside of that world. No matter how well that world had been hidden or how deeply it had been hidden, there would definitely be traces left behind. However, that was not the case. Without the proof given by the battle god's son, Luo Fan would not be able to find traces of the Taoist field outside of that Taoist field. Even if he could directly see through the laws of heaven and earth, and even directly see the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, he would not be able to find any traces of the existence of that Taoist field. Under such circumstances, he originally thought that the sage's methods were exquisite and unimaginable. However, now that he thought about it, the truth might not be so. Could it be that this Taoist field is not in heaven and earth, but outside of heaven and earth in the state of chaos? That's impossible. If that's the case, doesn't that mean that a Taoist field is a world like heaven and earth? Luo Fan asked with a frown. Hearing this, the battle god's son shook his head and sighed. It's not as you think. These Taoist fields are indeed not in heaven and earth, but outside of heaven and earth. However, they're not the same world as heaven and earth. In fact, although they exist outside of heaven and earth, they're just like some spots on an eggshell. They are worlds that exist by relying on heaven and earth. Worlds that exist by relying on heaven and earth, like spots on an eggshell. Listening to the battle god's son's explanation, Luo Fan instantly came to a realization. He had already understood the form in which these Taoist fields existed. Outside of the perfect heaven and earth, there was a boundless state of chaos. This was not a fact that could be changed. Whether it was the untainted land, the Earth universe, or even the Great Tianyuan world and the Great Jili world, it was the same. Only a perfect heaven and earth could withstand the erosion and assimilation of the state of chaos, and could exist eternally in the state of chaos. Chapter 1054. Just like the sword lunatic, didn't he rely on his innate zenith heaven realm and various special opportunities to directly enter the state of chaos, and even open up a small world that existed for a very short period of time? Although he eventually disappeared with his life, and all traces of his existence were completely erased by the earth and the universe. Even his traces in other people's memories had completely disappeared. But after all, he could already barely complete the state of opening up a world in the state of chaos. Even an innate zenith heaven realm cultivator could do it. For peak sage to be like Luo Fan and Battle God Sun, whose cultivation realm had reached an unimaginable level, if they were willing to pay the price, they could naturally do it more easily. Since opening up a world in the state of chaos was not impossible for them, then the difference between them and sages was the size of the world and how long the world could last. For sages, the world that they opened up was close to a perfect world and could exist in the state of chaos for a long time. Even if it was not as nearly eternal as a perfect world, it was not something that could be achieved by anyone who was not a sage. The time that it could exist for was probably as long as 1,000,000,000,000 years. Of course, for the state of chaos, time did not have any meaning. The time that could exist for billions of years was only a matter within the world. Unless it could exist eternally, it would not have any meaning to other worlds. This seemed complicated, but it was actually very simple. If the world that was opened up in the state of chaos was not eternal, then there was a limit to the evolution of time within it, such as billions of years. Then, when the living beings in other worlds contacted this world in 1 second, they might be in the initial state of the world. Then, when they contacted this world in the next second, it might be more than billions of years later. In this way, compared to the living beings that contacted this world, the time that this world existed was equivalent to only 1 second. If the time of this world was eternal, then it would be different. This was the connection between this second and the next second. Even though there were billions of trillions of years between this world and the next, and even though the world had already changed, it still existed. For him, this world still existed. For him, the time that this world existed was naturally as eternal as the world it was in. Therefore, eternity was the difference between a perfect world and an imperfect world. Of course, there was a huge difference between a great world and a perfect world. This was something that Luo Fan could not understand at this moment. Since it was very difficult for sages to create a perfect world, did it mean that they could not create a world that could exist forever in the state of chaos? Of course, that was not the case. In fact, they only needed to undergo a slight change, and they would be able to easily establish a world that could exist eternally. That was to completely combine the space-time of the newly created world with a perfect world. The pressure from the chaotic state was transferred to the perfect heaven and earth, thus allowing the perfect heaven and earth to completely fuse with it. Between them, one would suffer and the other would prosper. Thus, this world could exist eternally from another point of view. After understanding this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. So that's how it is. These are indeed the spots on the eggshell formed by the heavens and the earth, Luo Fan murmured. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Battle God Sun heaved a sigh of relief. It was obvious that he had to explain this complicated situation himself. It was really difficult for him. At this time, Luo Fan was able to understand this, which really made him heave a sigh of relief. Since you understand this, then it's easy. The dojo given by the sages is actually a small world that is attached to this world like a spot on the eggshell. Such a world would be one with the entire world, and the world would not be harmed. It will never be damaged, Battle God Sun said with a smile. If the world is not damaged, it will not be damaged? Luo Fan repeated. Then, he came to a realization and nodded. According to the theory, That is correct. Seeing that Luo Fan still understood his words, Battle Godson was already a little excited. After all, his words are really vague. If other people heard his words, there would certainly be countless questions. He could even think of these questions himself, but he simply couldn't find any way to refute them and make people believe in his reasoning. But now, Luo Fan completely understood what he said. Looking at his matter-of-fact appearance, it was obvious that he really believed what he said was correct. It was even possible that he had a clear understanding of all the questions that he could think of but couldn't refute, and could completely refute them. For him, this was of course something that made him extremely happy. In a happy mood, Battle Godson's speed of speaking became even more brisk. In fact, the time that the sages have existed is already unknown. We, the disciples of the sages, have existed for hundreds of billions of years, so much so that each of us can be called a living history. However, even Fuzi, who has cultivated for the longest time, doesn't know how many disciples of the sages there were before us. Battle Godson smiled and said, "Such a cruel fact." Luo Fan frowned and said, "If according to what you said, any disciple of the sages will be bestowed with a Taoist field by the sages, doesn't that mean that there are actually more than a few dozen Taoist fields outside this world, but there is an unknown number or even a very large number of Taoist fields?" "Huh. It's so pleasant to communicate with Taoist friend." "That's exactly what I mean." Battle Godson laughed out loud. Luo Fan opened his mouth and couldn't help but smile bitterly. This was really possible. It should be known that it was possible for him to create a world in the state of chaos, although it was impossible for him to merge it with the perfect world and transfer the erosion of the state of chaos to the perfect world, and he would have to pay a great price. But a possibility was a possibility. For the omnipotent sages, it was naturally even easier. And what he couldn't do was to merge that small world with the perfect world. For the sages, it was naturally an extremely easy and simple matter. Under such circumstances, it could be imagined that for the sages, directly opening up a Taoist field to bestow upon their disciples was much easier than sorting out and clearing out an existing and abandoned Taoist field. In this way, it was very obvious. The most likely situation was that for every disciple of the sages would open up a Taoist field outside this world and bestow it to the sages. And for every disciple of the sages who died, the sages would completely ignore those Taoist fields and directly let them be abandoned. They would be allowed to attach themselves to the world and not care about it. In this way, over a long period of time, the number of Taoist fields that appeared after generations of sages would definitely reach an extremely impressive level. Battle Godson smiled, and his mood became a little depressed. He sighed and said, "The number of Taoist fields of my predecessors. It's more than you can imagine. Among them, there were even many seniors who had already set foot on the ninth step. It's just that they have now been annihilated in the endless years, leaving behind only those shocking Taoist fields." It was obvious that Battle Godson had thought of himself from these Taoist fields. Right now, he had barely set foot on the peak of the demi-sage realm, the third step of the 9 steps below the sage realm. He was still very far away from the 9th step. An existence like him, in front of the existence that had set foot on the 9th step, did not even have the chance to attack. The other party only needed to glance at him, and he would be annihilated in both body and soul. However, such a powerful existence, who also had the protection of the sages, who also had wonderful cultivation conditions, had now turned into nothingness. Only their abandoned Taoist fields were left above the world. In comparison, an existence like him, who had set foot on the 3rd step, how far could he go? Could he set foot on the 9th step? Could he break through the 9th step and become a sage? This caused him to feel an inexplicable sense of loss for a moment. After a while, Battle Godson finally came back to his senses. He smiled bitterly and apologized. Luo Fan naturally understood Battle Godson's feelings and said, "You don't have to be like this. You and I are both people who seek the Tao. Both of us are at a loss for the future. However, we are still progressing step by step. Who knows if the opportunity to become a sage will come?" "You're right." Battle Godson merely smiled. It was obvious that he accepted Luo Fan's good intentions of comforting him. However, he did not think that Luo Fan's words made sense. Luo Fan only said this sentence, but he didn't mean to ask for Battle Godson's approval. Therefore, he did not continue this topic. Since you're talking about this, could it be that you have a way to explore the abandoned Taoist fields? Luo Fan asked. The Taoist fields given by the sages were not simple. After all, they were outside of the world. Even if they were attached to the world and could enter the Taoist field directly without crossing the chaos, it was still not simple. Didn't you see that Battle Godson needed the proof to enter the Taoist fields of other sages? As a result, it was obvious that the abandoned Tao grounds had been abandoned for countless years. By now, the cultivators who had entered the abandoned Tao grounds had long been annihilated. So how could there be any proof left? Without the proof, it was impossible to even find the Taoist fields, let alone enter them. That is correct. Battle Godson directly confirmed Luo Fan's guess. I would like to hear the details. Luo Fan's eyes brightened. The Taoist fields given by the sages were actually heaven and earth, each world. Each world contained the mysteries of the Taos cultivated by the sages. If he was able to walk through all of them and comprehend them one by one, then it would be able to greatly expand his knowledge and allow him to comprehend even more of the Taos cultivated by the saints. Thus, it would become the accumulation of his cultivation. Battle Godson smiled and said, "Friend, please follow me." As he spoke, he stood up, lifted his feet, and disappeared into the palace. This action of disappearing in an instant was perhaps untraceable to normal living beings. However, to an existence like Luo Fan, it was the same as turning around and leading the way in front of an ordinary person. There was not the slightest obstacle. Therefore, Luo Fan also smiled, stood up, and followed behind Battle Godson. He also disappeared from this place. Both of them were extremely resourceful. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at a certain location in the depths of the victorious battle palace. This place was an underground space. It was also like a world. The space was boundless, and the sky was guiding the sun, moon, and stars through some inexplicable method. Everything in the universe did not have the darkness and suffocation of the underground space. Could this be the ocean of darkness? Luo Fan followed beside the battle god sun and arrived at the underground space. He looked down and said in surprise, "This boundless underground space was like a boundless ocean. The waves in this ocean were pitch black and emitted an aura that was very comfortable to the soul. It was very similar to the ocean of darkness in the legends." Ocean of darkness? Let's call this place that from now on. Battle Godson thought for a moment after hearing Luo Fan's words and made a decision. Luo Fan could not help but feel a little helpless. This ocean is actually the origin of all life in the victorious battle palace. All of their injuries are actually healed by this ocean. As long as this ocean does not dry up, all living things will never die. Therefore, calling it the ocean of darkness is actually very fitting, Battle Godson said with a smile. Luo Fan shook his head, smiled bitterly, and did not say anything. Battle Godson brought Luo Fan to a platform in a corner of the ocean of darkness. This platform had a radius of hundreds of thousands of feet. The entire platform was flat and smooth. There were countless lines faintly visible on the surface. These patterns were very mysterious and contained infinite mysteries. It was as if they were demonstrating a Tao that Luo Fan had never seen before. Luo Fan's current perception and observation were powerful beyond imagination. With just a glance, he had a general idea of what the Tao was. It was a kind of soul-spirit Tao that sought to control all souls and create all souls. It was very compatible with the function of the ocean of darkness. What a treasure! Luo Fan stepped on the platform and felt his divine soul tremble slightly. There was a vague feeling of comfort. This caused him to involuntarily exclaim in admiration. One must know, right now, the stability of Luo Fan's divine soul had reached an unbelievable level. Just by touching it, without even releasing any aura, it was able to shake his spirit and make him feel so comfortable. The power of this object had truly reached an earth-shattering level. It even felt much stronger than the long rod in Battle God Sun's hand. This is a magic treasure that I obtained through a fortuitous encounter. It was not bestowed by a supreme sage. Instead, it was refined by a senior who had set foot on the 8th step. Back then, I obtained this item, which allowed me to build the dojo into what it is now. If I didn't have this item, I'm afraid my dojo would have become a cruel killing ground. It would not be as normal as it is now. Battle God Sun looked at the platform and said emotionally. Luo Fan naturally understood what he meant. Without the platform to replenish the energy of the living beings on the dojo and ensure that they did not die, every battle that took place on the dojo could result in the death of a living being. As such, if fighting was the only thing on the dojo, then the dojo would eventually become a cruel killing ground. There would no longer be any trust between living beings. There would only be killing each other. How could it be like this? Fighting was fighting, but what should be done was done. A cultivator who set foot on the 8th step is indeed shockingly powerful. Luo Fan exclaimed. That senior is also a disciple of a sage. It's just that he has been around for too long, so I don't know which sage he is. Maybe he's my senior brother or senior sister from the same sect. Battle God's Sun chuckled. Fellow Taoist has brought me here. Could it be that you want to use this thing to find that senior's abandoned dojo? Luo Fan asked with a smile. The smile on Battle God Sun's face froze. Why are you so smart? I haven't said anything yet, but you already know. Luo Fan knew he had guessed correctly. He chuckled. Battle God Sun was shocked by Luo Fan's words, but he quickly recovered and said, That's right. I've had this item for hundreds of billions of years. Due to my lack of strength, I could only borrow a small portion of its power to build the foundation of the victorious battle palace. Now that I've set foot on the 3rd step, I have a chance to find the location of the abandoned dojo through this item. I see. When Luo Fan heard this, he came to a sudden realization. He knew why this item had been here for so many years, and why Battle God Sun was still interested in going to the abandoned dojo. It turned out that his strength was insufficient in the past, and he was unable to use this item to connect with the abandoned dojo to go to the dojo. Now that his strength had increased and he felt more confident, he decided to give it a try. Battle God Sun waved his hand, and a long rod appeared in his hand. This long rod was a treasure bestowed by a sage. Its level had surpassed the level of a peak demi-sage. It was extremely useful, and its power was limitless. Naturally, it couldn't just be used to fight or smash people. Battle God Sun held onto the long rod and stabbed it down. In an instant, the long rod and the platform collided. The entire platform shook violently, and an indescribable force was emitted from the platform. Chapter 1055. After this force appeared, it directly condensed and split into two, pouncing towards Luo Fan and the Battle God Sun. At this moment, the staff in the Battle God Sun's hand suddenly erupted with a dazzling golden light, and the shadow of a golden ape flashed. Then, the two forces that were attacking Luo Fan and the Battle God Sun suddenly condensed at the point where the staff and the platform came into contact. Not a single trace of it leaked out. It looked as if nothing had happened after the staff and the platform collided. The Battle God Sun maintained this position for a good while. The power in his body surged endlessly, and the golden light on the staff flowed up and down like water. It took a long time for it to calm down. After everything had calmed down, the Battle God Sun pulled the staff up. On the smooth surface of the platform below the staff, there was a strange, circular talisman that looked like the cross-section of a staff. The talisman was densely packed with unknown runes. These runes were completely formed by the combination of the golden light and the terrifying power that had gushed out from the platform. The golden light restricted the dissipation of the power, and that power determined the shape of the runes. It's done. The Battle God Sun looked at the circular talisman and smiled. As he spoke, he raised his hand, and the circular talisman suddenly flew up and landed in his hand. When the talisman was in his hand, the Battle God Sun closed his eyes slightly, as if he was comprehending the various mysteries of the talisman. After a while, He nodded his head in satisfaction and said to Luo Fan, "It's done. This is the proof of entry to the dojo of that senior." As he spoke, he handed the talisman to Luo Fan. Luo Fan took the talisman and instantly felt a certain aura flowing into his body. At the same time, this aura was accompanied by endless information. This information was similar to the proof of entry to the dojo that the Battle God Sun had given him. It was also the same countless, complex, and mysterious changes that ultimately pointed to a point in time. I see. Fellow's method is indeed mysterious. Luo Fan praised and handed the talisman back to the Battle God Sun. The Battle God Sun chuckled and said, "It's just a small trick. Now that we know where the place is, why don't we go in?" Luo Fan was naturally indifferent. He nodded. Seeing Luo Fan nod, the Battle God Sun smiled and said, "In that case, let's leave the victorious Battle Palace first. In order to enter the dojo, we have to find the door into heaven and earth. Before the connection is established, there is no way to find any door to enter." Immediately, the two of them lifted their feet and stepped out of the underground space. Then, they turned into two streaks of light and shot upward. Not long after, he had already left the Battle God Sun's dojo, the Battle God Palace, and once again arrived in the void above the sea of clouds. Battle God Sun sensed the talisman that had just been condensed. After confirming the direction and distance, he and Luo Fan shot out in a certain direction. Their speed was quite astonishing, but the location of the door was quite far away from where they were. It took them half a day to reach a void that was billions of light years away from the door of the Battle God Palace. "It's here." The Battle God Sun confirmed the mark on the talisman again and said to Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked around. He discovered that the vital energy here was rather chaotic. Looking down, he discovered that there was already a boundless sea down below, and it was an extremely desolate sea. At a glance, there were no traces of intelligent life within a radius of hundreds of millions of kilometers. There were only barbaric life forms that grew up in dangerous places. Obviously, this was not an area where cultivators often moved around. From a certain perspective, it was already the edge of the world. Of course, it was only from a certain perspective. It did not mean that further out was the end of the world. The Battle God Sun floated in the void. He lifted his hand and pointed forward. In an instant, the space-time shook. An invisible wave began to form from where he pointed. Circles of ripples began to spread from where he pointed. The way the ripples spread, it was as if this space-time was undergoing some kind of earth-shattering change. At the moment, the Battle God Sun's face was a little pale. His body was also trembling slightly. The power in his body surged endlessly. It was obvious that he was giving it his all. He was currently enduring an extremely shocking pressure. It was obvious that the origin of the certificate he had condensed was not correct. It created many obstacles for him to enter the dojo, making it impossible for him to enter it as smoothly as he did in other dojos. It should be known that whether it was Wu Dao Zi's Qilin Cliff or his own Battle God Palace, the Battle God Sun had entered them extremely easily. It was almost as if he had stepped into a bubble. Why would he need to use all his strength like this? It was as if he had used all his strength. Luo Fan looked at the Battle God Sun's actions and felt the changes in the surrounding space-time. He sighed inwardly. The dojo given by the saint was indeed not simple. Previously, he did not think much of the defense of the dojo when he had the certificate. Now that he had lost the certificate, he realized that the defense of the dojo was so terrifying. Even with the simulated certificate, he still had to work so hard. Fortunately, it was the Battle God Sun who had used it. The Battle God Sun had already set foot on the third step. His cultivation realm was much stronger than Luo Fan's. The power in his body was also much more than his. If Luo Fan were to open the door of the dojo, the difficulty would definitely be much higher than the Battle God Sun. Luo Fan would definitely be in a much more difficult situation than the Battle God Sun. It was extremely likely that the time he would spend would be several times more than the Battle God Sun. This process continued for 3 days and 3 nights. After 3 days and 3 nights, the Battle God Sun let out a long roar. At the same time, his finger directly pierced into the void. As his finger pierced in, the space-time ripples that were spreading continuously produced layers of fluctuations. They suddenly condensed and formed an irregular circular hole in front of Luo Fan and the battle god Sun. The battle god Sun's hand also appeared in the hole after the hole appeared. It was as if the hole was directly pierced by his finger. "All right." The battle god Sun let out a long sigh and said. An incomparably rich and strange aura surged out from the hole. This aura contained a charm that made one's soul dance with joy. Anyone who breathed in it would feel incomparably wonderful and comfortable. Luo Fan peered into the hole. It was a dusky world. There are thousands of continents floating in the boundless void. Each of these continents seemed like a world of its own. There were also the sun, moon, and stars among them, as well as various mechanisms that a normal world should have. It's been billions of years. I wonder how the dojo has developed. The battle god Sun's face was still somewhat pale. It was clear that he had exhausted too much power. He had yet to recover. Since you want to know, why don't we enter and take a look? Luo Fan smiled. The battle god Sun laughed. That's how it should be. Fellow cultivator, please. As the two spoke, they stepped into the door. The moment the two of them stepped through the door, the hole they had opened earlier suddenly disappeared, as if it had never been there. It's indeed a pirated copy. There are too many omissions in it. Battle god Sun felt the big hole behind him disappear. He chuckled and raised his hand to rub it. The circular talisman that he had painstakingly made before was instantly rubbed into nothingness. It completely disappeared as if it had never been there. Then he grabbed in the void and condensed some invisible and intangible space-time information together. It directly turned into countless complicated and mysterious runes and condensed into a talisman. This is the talisman to enter the dojo. Fellow cultivator, you can integrate this talisman into the talisman that I gave you before. In that case, the proof will also have the effect of entering the dojo. The battle god's Sun smiled at Luo Fan. The battle god's Sun's technique of grabbing the space-time information was extremely exquisite. It contained many inexplicable mysteries. If Luo Fan had not seen the battle god Sun use this method, he would certainly not have known that there was such a method to condense the space-time information into a talisman. But at this moment, the situation was naturally different. Although the battle god Sun's method of grasping the space-time information was mysterious, for an existence at the Down Master level like Luo Fan, he could see through the principle at a glance. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan already knew how to use this method. Hearing the battle god Sun's words, Luo Fan nodded and said with a smile, "Thank you for your advice." As he spoke, he shook his left hand, and the talisman from before appeared in his hand. Then he grabbed in the void with his right hand. His movement was even more natural and elegant than the battle god Sun's. Under this grasp, the space-time information in the void condensed into countless runes at a speed faster than the battle god Sun. Finally, it formed a talisman. After the talisman was formed, Luo Fan raised his hand and slapped it directly into the talisman in his left hand. The two merged into one, and in the blink of an eye, they were inseparable. After the two merged into one, Luo Fan felt that the information in the aura from the talisman contained the location of this Taoist field. Moreover, it was many times more precise than the round talisman that the battle god Sun had condensed in the victorious battle palace. Looking at Luo Fan's movement, the battle god Sun could not help but admire him. He also slapped the talisman into the talisman that he possessed. Every time I see you comprehending a wonderful method, I feel a sense of inferiority. After doing this, the battle god Sun sighed and said to Luo Fan, "You're too humble." Luo Fan just smiled. This kind of small method, whether it was for the battle god Sun or for him, or even for any peak sage to be, was a matter of course. Such a compliment from the battle god Sun was simply a statement to him. Perhaps there was not much praise in his heart. The battle god Sun just chuckled. All of a sudden, his expression changed slightly. At the same time, Luo Fan felt an invisible force suddenly condensing behind him. Then, a part of this force split off and blasted towards him. Luo Fan's expression changed. He turned around, and a bright red axe appeared in his hand. He fiercely slashed at the force that split off and blasted towards him. In an instant, the huge axe and the force collided. A shocking roar suddenly reverberated throughout the entire Taoist field. The entire Taoist field seemed to shake violently due to this collision. A shriek rang out, and the power suddenly disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had never appeared. That collision was a huge pressure on Luo Fan. He even felt as if he had collided with the long rod in the battle god's son's hand. That kind of shock made him feel as if his entire body was sore and numb. Faintly, he felt as if he couldn't bear that collision. After a long while, he just recovered. What was that just now? As soon as he recovered, the battle god's son frowned and asked, "I don't know either. It seemed to be some kind of soul body, but a soul body shouldn't be so strong. If I hadn't reacted quickly, I'm afraid my life would have been in danger." Luo Fan frowned and said. At that moment, he couldn't see clearly what that thing was at all. He could only rely on the impact of that force. Through the feeling of the moment when the axe and the force came into contact, he knew that it was very likely to be an existence similar to the spirit. However, the spirit soul of an ordinary creature, even if Luo Fan had reached the Tao Master Realm at this time, had its limits. It was impossible for it to be as strong and powerful as the body, at least for the current Luo Fan. If a spirit wanted to be on par with him, it would at least need to set foot on the third or fourth step. Could it be a soul body? The battle god's son frowned. That thing just now wasn't targeting him. Although his senses were sharp, that thing appeared too quickly. Moreover, it was completely invisible. Regardless of whether it was his senses or his eyes, he couldn't see what exactly it was that existed in that position. He could only feel some kind of terrifying power erupting from there. At this moment, he fell into hesitation. I didn't expect that this Taoist rite, which hasn't been seen for billions of years, would have such a change and give birth to such an incredible existence. It seems that coming here this time is the right choice. After hesitating for a while, an inexplicable smile appeared on the battle god's son's face. At this moment, Luo Fan also smiled and nodded in agreement with the battle god's son. For the two of them, if this Taoist rite was still the same as the Taoist rite they had seen before, if they could see everything inside the Taoist right at a glance, then what was the point of coming here? Just like now, there was something that they couldn't see clearly, which made them feel a little surprised and confused. That was really interesting and worth a trip. He looked up and looked around. In a trance, Luo Fan had a feeling that the entire Taoist rite was being seen by him. However, he faintly felt that the Taoist right in his eyes seemed to be covered with a faint layer of fog. Under this fog, there was a deeper layer of mystery. There was something even more incredible hidden behind it. It's useless to look at it from here. Why don't we go to those worlds to take a look? Luo Fan looked for a while and suggested to the battle god's son with a smile. The battle god's son also couldn't see through this Taoist rite. After hearing Luo Fan's words, he nodded and agreed to his suggestion. Immediately, the two of them turned into long rainbows and directly rushed into the continent closest to where they were. It was a continent that looked like a complete world. As soon as they entered this continent, the expressions of Luo Fan and the battle god's son changed slightly. Because at this moment, the two of them simultaneously felt that their bodies, their power, and their spirits had all undergone a huge change. Their originally vast and boundless power, their powerful and almost indestructible bodies, and their spirits that could see through everything had instantly weakened by many times. In the blink of an eye, they had reached a level that was only a few million times stronger than a normal human. To them, being a few million times stronger than a normal human was only equivalent to the power they had when they had just achieved the immortal path and were still in the itinerant immortal realm. This kind of weakening of their bodies was really subverting everything for the two of them. How could they not be shocked? The two of them looked at each other. Countless thoughts flashed through their minds in that instant. After a while, they both let out a sigh of relief at the same time. It's just the rules of this Taoist rite. The excess power is only suppressed and shielded. It hasn't completely disappeared. As long as we leave this place, it will naturally return to normal. There's no need to worry, Luo Fan said to the battle god's son. While he was thinking, he had already sensed the source of the change in himself. He knew that it was similar to the situation he had experienced in a certain dreamscape, but the intensity was not comparable to that time. Exactly. I wonder if that senior has set up this dojo in this manner, or if this dojo has developed itself after being abandoned. The dojo godson spoke in a somewhat relaxed manner. Although this change was a bit uncomfortable for the two of them, they were able to accept it when they recalled that this was the dojo of a cultivator who had reached the 8th step. After all, a cultivator who had set foot on the 8th step was tens of thousands of times stronger than a cultivator who had set foot on the 3rd step like the battle god's son. Coming to such a place, it was normal for one's strength to be restricted a little. This was the privilege of those with great strength. Chapter 1056. The place where the two of them landed was directly above the sea of clouds. There was a sun, a moon, and stars on this piece of land, just like a complete world. Naturally, there was also a sky and a sea of clouds. Originally, before the two of them entered this world, or rather, this piece of land, they wanted to land directly where the intelligent life in this world gathered. However, at this moment, their strength was restricted the moment they entered this world, and they became billions of times weaker than before. This sudden weakness made them involuntarily become cautious, and they did not dare to land carelessly. Instead, they planned to use their outstanding eyesight to observe what this piece of land looked like and what special characteristics it had. The two of them did not discuss this decision, but they made the same decision at the same time. Floating above the sea of clouds, Luo Fan and the battle god's son looked at each other. An inexplicable joy suddenly appeared in their eyes. I originally thought that this abandoned dojo wouldn't bring us many benefits, but I never thought that there would be such a change. It's a pleasant surprise, Luo Fan said to the battle god's son. The battle god's son smiled and nodded and said, "Indeed, I never thought that this would happen." The reason why the two of them felt this way was not only because this piece of land could restrict their strength, but also because it made them feel as if their own strength was only at this level. It was also because after they stabilized, they realized that this piece of land was filled with an extremely mysterious aura. This aura contained some sort of supreme charm. It seemed to directly display countless unimaginable mysteries, making them feel as if they were receiving some kind of strange information with every breath they took, and they were obtaining some mysteries that they had never understood before. Such a change was naturally an extremely rare opportunity for the two of them, who were pursuing a higher realm. Looking down, the piece of land was extremely vast. In fact, Luo Fan felt that this piece of land was even vaster than the entire solar system. On this piece of land, there were mountains, rivers, flowers, and trees. Insects, fish, birds, and beasts. All kinds of things that a normal world should have could be found there. The entire world exuded a sense of vicissitudes, as if it had experienced endless years. Every tiny piece of soil and stone had an endless history, as if they had experienced endless years, and the living beings that lived on this piece of land. Furthermore, it was a type of living being that resembled a soul. These creatures were essentially illusory existences in the outside world. Perhaps it could only be called a ghost. However, on this continent, due to some subtle laws, these spirit-like living beings were like real living beings with flesh and blood. Luo Fan and the battle god's son were essentially Dao masters and peak sage-to-be. It was impossible to tell what their true nature was. Luo Fan stared at the creatures for a long time before he sighed. These creatures are not naturally born in this dojo. The battle god's son didn't see this and couldn't help but ask in surprise, "Why do you say that? Fellow Taoist, please take a look at their life source." Luo Fan sighed, raised his hand, and pointed downward. The battle god's son carefully observed for a long time before he let out a long sigh and said, "I see. If you hadn't pointed it out, I'm afraid I wouldn't have found it at all." The life source of these living beings contained all the traces of their development from birth to the present, just like the DNA that the mortals in Luo Fan's previous life only knew. It was just that the life source was more advanced than DNA, and there were more traces left in it. From the traces left in the life source, the battle god sun could directly see how the pneuma of this piece of land combined with each other over a long period of time and gave birth to the first simple living beings on this piece of land, and how these living beings reproduced and evolved and finally gave birth to this rich and colorful world, and even gave birth to the intelligent living beings that now ruled this entire piece of land. These intelligent living beings looked like humans, which was the appearance of the natural Taoism body of this world, and looked the same as the living beings in the outside world. However, their nature was completely different, and there was even nothing in common between their development. The reason for this development was very simple. It was because all the rules, all the laws, and even the great Tao in the dojo were completely of the same origin as the world. Under these circumstances, the truly stable living beings that could truly grow up in this dojo would naturally leave behind the natural appearance of the natural Taoism body after a long period of natural selection. After understanding the origin of these living beings, the battle god's son couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. He even felt that he had made the right decision to come here. These living beings weren't very powerful in themselves. This was because there was some kind of mysterious restriction on this piece of land. Among these living beings, the strongest existence was only at the level of Luo Fan and the battle god's son after they were restricted. In other words, it was equivalent to the level of an itinerant immortal. In terms of power level, Luo Fan and the battle god's son could easily open up thousands of detachments in such a world. However, the living beings in this world had developed from nothing, so the situation was completely different. This civilization that was developed from scratch, without any external interference, could completely embody the profundities of the laws of this dojo. They could completely embody the principles contained in the strange aura that filled this dojo. As long as they could comprehend the profundities, it might not be possible for them to make a huge breakthrough, but it would allow them to comprehend the Tao that their seniors who cultivated the Tao of soul had cultivated countless trillions of years ago. It would allow them to communicate with that predecessor from another perspective. This was clearly an extremely rare and beneficial senior. No matter what the predecessor cultivated, and no matter how many years had passed since then, he was still a powerful existence that had stepped onto the 8th step. However, he was, after all, a powerful existence that had already stepped into the 8th step. The distance between him and a saint was many times closer than that of Luo Fan and the battle god's son. It was easy to imagine the benefits of being able to communicate with such an existence. The cultivation civilization of this continent is quite strong, and it has unearthed the magical use of the rules and laws of this side of the world to the extreme. Luo Fan carefully analyzed for a while, then let out such a sigh. The cultivation civilization on this mainland was, of course, many times worse than that of the outside world. After all, the strongest person was only equivalent to the level of an itinerant immortal. However, if it was placed in this environment, in this kind of situation where even Luo Fan and the battle god's son could be absolutely restricted, the cultivation civilization on this mainland could be said to have developed to the extreme. There were tens of thousands of living beings on this mainland who were as powerful as Luo Fan and the battle god's son. Let's not talk about it. Let's talk about the cultivation system of this mainland. It had already extremely perfectly matched the rules of this world, the aura of this world. This could be seen from their cultivation. What kind of cultivation level did Luo Fan and the battle god's son have? If they wanted to know more specific information, they didn't need to go to this mainland to look for it. They only needed to slightly analyze the situation of the many cultivators in this world and then carefully compare it with the many existing books. To them, even if they had been weakened many times, there was still a difference in essence. No matter how deep the books were hidden in this world, they still couldn't stop them from investigating. Naturally, they had an extremely deep understanding of this world's cultivation system. In this cultivation system, there were even many exquisite parts that Luo Fan couldn't understand at the moment. This world had gone through countless years of development and had long recognized the essence of their own existence. They completely understood that they were soul bodies, that they were a kind of existence that was almost illusory, without the support of flesh and blood. Their cultivation system was completely built on this fact. This world's cultivation system was divided into a total of 6 great realms, and each realm was divided into 10 levels. After reaching the completion of the 6 great realms, the cultivation of this world's cultivation method had already reached the end. These 6 great realms corresponded to the 6 great realms before the immortal path. After cultivating these 6 great realms, the cultivation realm was the level of achieving the immortal path. And the 10 levels of each realm corresponded to the 3 souls and 7 spirits of a human body. Each realm was to refine one of the 10 parts of the 3 souls and 7 spirits. Through this kind of repeated training, the 3 souls and 7 spirits were constantly turning illusory into reality, changing their original illusory essence. When they finally completed the 6 great realms and became an itinerant immortal, their tempering had already reached the end. Their essence would obtain the final sublimation. In the end, from illusory to reality, they would become true living beings. Although they were still soul bodies, they were no different from real living beings with flesh and blood, and they no longer had any weaknesses. This kind of cultivation system was precise, mysterious, and contained an indescribable power of creation. Even Luo Fan and the battle god Sun couldn't help but sigh in admiration when they saw it. This kind of perfect or even near perfect cultivation system could only be created by cultivators who had reached an unimaginable level and could overlook all the laws of this world from an extremely high altitude. Otherwise, it would require countless generations of cultivators, endless years, and countless deaths to finally form it. This could be said to be the highest achievement of a civilization, but it was qualified for the 2 of them to sigh in admiration. The battle god Sun was overjoyed and said to Luo Fan, "I want to split a part of my soul into this world's cultivation world and cultivate this method from scratch. What do you think?" Luo Fan also smiled and said, "I have the same intention. Why don't we do it?" The 2 of them looked at each other for a while and laughed. After the 2 of them learned about this world's cultivation system, they both felt that this cultivation system contained mysteries that they couldn't figure out in a short period of time. For a moment, they were so excited that they decided to cultivate it themselves in order to understand the mysteries. Perhaps the mysteries of this world's cultivation will bring me some surprises. Luo Fan smiled. With a slight thought, an insignificant trace of his spirit, which was almost the size of a speck of dust on a planet, was separated from his spirit. This bit of spirit was so insignificant to him. If he didn't use his super strong perception and analysis ability as a town master to compare and observe, he wouldn't even be able to notice that his spirit had separated from his spirit. However, compared to Luo Fan's spirit, which was so vast that it was unimaginable, this insignificant spirit was even more than 100 times stronger than a normal person's spirit. After this bit of spirit was separated, it twisted and changed in the void. In the blink of an eye, it formed a somewhat transparent and somewhat illusory figure in the void. From the looks of it, it was Luo Fan. Just as Luo Fan was doing this, an illusory figure also appeared in front of the battle god Sun, who was next to Luo Fan. It was also the same as the battle god Sun. However, the illusory figure of the battle god Sun was wearing a faint golden light, showing the difference between it and the illusory figure that Luo Fan had condensed. After the 2 illusory figures were formed, they both smiled. They casually pointed. The 2 figures turned into 2 invisible rays of light. They fell to the ground below. In the blink of an eye, they were thrown into the bellies of 2 pregnant women who were extremely far away and turned into fetuses. They were waiting for the day of childbirth. At this moment, there was suddenly a burst of aura, which was the peak of the world, emerging from all over the earth. These auras contained vigilance, shock, horror, and even anxiety. Following these auras the atmosphere of the entire world began to change. There was a vague feeling that a storm was coming. Luo Fan and the battle god Sun were slightly shocked. However, the two of them were not ordinary people after all, so they instantly understood what was going on. It was obvious that these two clones had thrown themselves into the world and instantly touched the laws of the world. This had affected the originally smooth and perfect circulation system of the world, thus arousing the attention of the cultivators who were extremely sensitive to the changes of the world. And such a change had obviously happened before, which made them feel that some unwelcome changes were about to happen. That was why the current situation had appeared. It seems that our clones will not have a peaceful life in this life. Luo Fan chuckled at the battle god Sun. It's better not to have a peaceful life. If they spend their lives peacefully and cultivate peacefully, wouldn't it be a lot less fun? The battle god Sun also laughed. I see that there are many continents in this dojo. I wonder if they're the same as this one. Why don't we go and take a look now? Luo Fan laughed for a while and suggested to the battle god Sun. The battle god Sun was also a little curious, so he naturally nodded in agreement with Luo Fan's suggestion. After the two of them reached an agreement, they did not stay there any longer. They turned around and left. In just a few steps, they had left the area of influence of this continent. The moment they stepped out of the area of influence of this continent, an indescribable feeling of comfort rose from their hearts. However, at that moment, their strength that had been suppressed and blocked instantly recovered. The feeling of weakness and discomfort that existed before completely disappeared in an instant. It's still this comfortable. The battle god Sun took a deep breath and let out a long sigh. The two of them did not stop. They lifted their feet and took a step forward. In an instant, they had already stepped into another continent. This time, the moment they stepped into it, the two of them also felt an indescribable suppression that appeared out of nowhere. Their strength was once again suppressed by an unknown number of times. However, compared to the previous continent, their strength after being suppressed was much stronger. There's actually a true immortal realm. It's just a realm stronger than the previous continent. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He and the battle god Sun looked at each other. They were both extremely shocked. The suppression was different for each continent, and the difference was just a realm's difference. This was something the two of them had not expected. Perhaps there are even more secrets hidden in this dojo. At that moment, the two of them had the same thought. With that thought, the two of them became vigilant at the same time. They also stopped above the sea of clouds and directly used their outstanding senses to observe the various situations on this continent. There were similarities between this continent and the previous one, but there were also differences. The similarity was that the living beings on this continent were also formed from the endless aura that existed on this continent. They had been condensed from nothing over countless years. Their species were also very similar to the previous continent. The appearance of the intelligent beings also looked like born Taoism aptitudes. However, the difference was that the strongest person on this continent was an existence equivalent to a true immortal realm. Moreover, although the cultivation system on this continent had also experienced countless years of refinement and countless generations of cultivators to become extremely perfect, it also had mysteries that Luo Fan and the battle god Sun had not comprehended. However, the entire system was almost completely different from the system on the previous continent. The difference between the two was like starting from the same starting point, but taking two completely different paths. In the end, they also turned into the same destination. On the previous continent, when cultivators were at the itinerant immortal realm, they could already turn nothingness into reality. They could sublimate their own life essence and truly become living beings with flesh and blood. However, on this continent, they could only do this when they were at the true immortal realm. Chapter 1057. The reason why he said this was because the real body formed when one cultivated the cultivation method of this continent to the peak was more compatible with the great Tao than when one cultivated to the true immortal realm according to the cultivation system of the previous continent. The more compatible with the great Tao, the more real the existence of the world and the dojo would be. Just this point alone was enough to show that the cultivation system of this mainland was several times stronger than that of the previous mainland. On top of that, the various remarkable abilities and methods of using power on this continent were even more exquisite and powerful than those on the previous continent. It could also increase the gap between the cultivation system of this continent and the cultivation system of the previous continent. Same as before, Luo Fan smiled at the battle god's son. Of course, the battle god's son also smiled. With that, the two of them did not hesitate and casually pointed their fingers. In an instant, just like on the previous mainland, two human silhouettes condensed in front of the two of them. Then, they directly descended and landed in two locations in the cultivation world that were extremely far away from each other. They entered the bellies of two pregnant women. They were waiting for the day of pregnancy and childbirth. After their actions, powerful auras also soared into the sky from various places on this mainland. They emitted a shocking aura, and the atmosphere of an impending storm filled the entire mainland. Clearly, the actions of Luo Fan and the battle god's son had also broken some kind of circulation system on this mainland. They had also aroused an intense reaction from the cultivators on this mainland. With such a reaction, even if this mainland had not reached the moment when the tribulation would be formed, in the next few years, it would definitely step into that tribulation. After all, the tribulation still happened because of people. Even if it was inevitable due to the circulation of karma, it would ultimately rely on the gratitude and hatred between cultivators to truly form this type of tribulation. Therefore, when all the powerful cultivators on these two mainland thought that the tribulation would appear soon, it would really appear soon. Luo Fan and the battle god's son were naturally very clear about this. The two of them looked at each other with anticipation in their eyes. The tribulation of these two mainland was naturally a disaster. This was naturally a disaster for all living beings on this continent. But for Luo Fan and the battle god's son, it was a kind of enjoyment, a kind of opportunity. It allowed them to better understand the various wonders of these two continents. He could feel the dazzling radiance of the civilizations of the two continents. This time, the two of them did not need to discuss. He lifted his foot and stepped forward lightly. At the same time, they stepped out of the range of the continent and appeared in the void outside the continent. Now that they were here, the two of them did not stop. He headed straight for another continent. The instant they set foot on this continent, they simultaneously felt that their powers were being suppressed to an astonishing degree. This kind of suppression caused their strength to fall below the immortal Tao. This restriction was comparable to the suppression they had suffered on the first continent. The two of them were shocked. This level of suppression was too shocking. Although the itinerant immortals on the first continent were suppressed to an extreme degree, they were still immortals after all. They were immortals after all, and they were still immortals. Their life essence was not weakened too much. But if they were suppressed to the immortal Tao, it would be like knocking immortals down to the mundane world. This kind of suppression was indeed many times more difficult than before. This time, the two of them did not land on the sea of clouds. Instead, they landed on an extremely tall mountain on the continent below. Here, they could see through the entire continent at a glance. Given their eyesight, it was almost impossible to miss out on any detail. Due to the fact that their strength had been suppressed far too harshly, they had spent over 100 times more time than they had spent on the previous two continents combined before they could barely get a clear view of the situation on this continent. This continent also had a flourishing cultivation civilization. Similarly, there were countless different kinds of strange creatures that existed there, forming a complete ecosystem. The cultivation world on this continent was also very mysterious. The cultivation system on this continent was different from the cultivation system on the previous two continents. Even the paths taken were different. This continent did not turn illusory into reality, nor did it turn illusory soul bodies into reality. The cultivation system on this continent cultivated the heart and the realm. As for one's own strength, or the Tao, they did not specifically cultivate it. Instead, they relied on the improvement of the heart and realm to naturally drive it. This method allowed the cultivation of this continent to not be restricted by the restrictions of this continent itself. On the contrary, the future of this continent was brighter than that of the previous two continents. Although their strength was limited to the immortal Tao, their hearts and realms could almost infinitely improve. In the end, they could even surpass the realm of true immortals, surpass the realm of golden immortals, and reach the terrifying level of primordial unity. This was something that the previous two continents could not compare to. I can't let this continent go. This thought directly grabbed Luo Fan's mind after he saw the situation of the cultivation world on this continent. He could not let it go for a long time. The battle god's son clearly had the same thought. At that moment, the two of them looked at each other at the same time. There was surprise in the depths of their eyes. Obviously, the two of them had the same thought. The reason for this was not complicated at all. This was because the way of thinking of the cultivation method on this continent was also a great reference for cultivators of their current realm. As long as they understood the principles, they could rely on these principles to create the corresponding method according to their own Tao. They could probably weaken the bottleneck they encountered, or in other words, slightly bypass the bottleneck, so that they could obtain the possibility of growth in their hearts and realms under the situation where their cultivation was shackled. Of course, this was only a possibility. After all, they still did not know the true nature of the cultivation method on this continent. What use was this to them now? Naturally, they could not be completely sure. However, even if the final effect was not great, as long as there was this opportunity, this hope, no matter how small, it was absolutely impossible for them to let it go. It was enough for them to pursue it with 100% effort. Under such circumstances, the spirit doppelgangers that the two of them created this time were more than 10 times stronger than the previous two continents. The two illusory figures were much more real than the previous two continents. After the two illusory figures appeared, they clapped their hands lightly. The two figures directly traversed through the void. They fell into the stomachs of two pregnant women in two different locations on this continent. What was different from the previous two continents was that this time, before the two spirit doppelgangers completely merged with this continent, there were many auras soaring into the sky from this continent. Although these auras were not very strong, they gave Luo Fan and the battle god Sun a feeling. They were more penetrating than the auras that came from the previous two continents. It was more agile, and the various negative emotions it contained were also less. This made Luo Fan and the battle god Sun look forward to this continent even more. Why don't we stay on this continent for a few years? Luo Fan suggested to the battle god Sun. Since this continent was so beneficial to them, staying here did not seem to be an unacceptable choice. In any case, for Luo Fan and the battle god Sun, their ultimate goal in entering this abandoned dojo was to find some things or mysteries that were useful to their cultivation. Since that was the case, there was not much difference between staying here and going somewhere else. Hearing Luo Fan's suggestion, the battle god Sun did not immediately agree. After all, he was not Luo Fan, and he was not used to doing things as he pleased like Luo Fan. It was still a little difficult for him to change his original plan immediately. After thinking for a while, the battle god Sun sighed and said, "There's not much difference between staying here and leaving. Well, let's stay here for a few years and personally feel the various wonderful uses of this world." Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and smiled. Then, the two exerted the power in their bodies to the limit and directly opened up two cave mansions in two locations on this mountain. Although their strength was limited to below the immortal path, they were after all existences at the Tao Master and peak Sage-to-Be level. After all, what they knew, what they saw, and what they heard were unimaginable. Although their strength was suppressed to this extent, their means would not become inferior because of this suppression. Although these two caves couldn't form their own space and time like when they weren't suppressed, they were still extremely mysterious, and their defensive capabilities were shockingly strong. not to mention the living beings on this continent whose strength was limited to below the immortal path. Even existences at the primordial unity pure yang level would not be able to destroy their cave mansions. In other words, with these two abodes, the two of them could absolutely guarantee that they would not be disturbed at all on this mainland. It was just a disturbance. To them, the power level of this mainland was too low. Even if they did not have abodes, they would not be worried about their own safety. After opening up the cave mansions, the two said goodbye and went into their own cave mansions. Afterwards, the two of them merged their thoughts into the two soul avatars that they had just split out. They could directly experience everything that their avatars had experienced and everything that their avatars had encountered. They had personally turned into fetuses on this continent to experience everything that a normal living being should experience. 10 months later, Luo Fan's doppelganger was born on this continent. On this day, the future legend was born on this continent. On this day, the pneuma of the whole continent surged, and the whole continent seemed to be trembling slightly, trembling because of this future legend. At that moment, the cultivation world on this continent became extremely active. The main body of the cultivation world on this continent was the cultivation sections. These cultivation sects had different ideas about cultivation and conflicts over cultivation resources, so there were countless competitions and battles. Since there was competition and battles, there was naturally a difference in strength. There were thousands of sects in the entire cultivation world, but among them, there were 36 really big sections. Each of these 36 great sects was a Leviathan. If each of these sects fully exerted their power, they could completely destroy the civilization on this continent. It could be said that these 36 sects were equivalent to the countries on Earth that had nuclear weapons when Luo Fan's doppelganger was born. Many sects in the cultivation world began to look everywhere for the source of the tremors that caused the entire continent to tremble. Almost at the same time, they all confirmed that a new round of civilization catastrophe on this continent had begun. The age of this continent's existence could no longer be determined. Even the most knowledgeable cultivators with the highest state of mind and the longest lifespan could not tell how long this continent had existed. All they knew was that every few years, this continent would experience a civilization catastrophe. This civilization catastrophe was extremely dangerous and cruel. Every time a civilization catastrophe occurred, every civilization catastrophe was a catastrophe for the entire continent. Every civilization catastrophe was a catastrophe for the entire continent. Every civilization catastrophe had a different cause, but the results were shockingly similar. Every civilization catastrophe, even if the outcome was the best for the cultivators, would still cause the entire cultivation civilization to be overturned. The many living beings on this continent, up to 90% of them died. Even in the distant legends, there were tens of thousands of civilization catastrophes that completely destroyed the entire continent, and all living beings were completely wiped out. As for why this continent still existed after the continent was completely destroyed and all living beings were completely wiped out, as for the living beings on this continent, this was not something that could be revealed in legends. At the very least, at this moment, no one in the cultivation world on this continent knew the reason behind this. How could this civilization catastrophe come so quickly? The last civilization catastrophe was only 30 million years ago. According to past history, the shortest time between civilizations should have been 129. 6 million years, a very puzzled voice murmured somewhere on this continent. If the creatures on this continent knew this location, they would know that this was the mountain gate of the Taishan sect, which was ranked 9th among the top 3 sects on this continent. The person who spoke was obviously a high-ranking member of the Taishan sect. What is there to be puzzled about? Since the shortest time between civilizations in history was 129, 6 million years, it means that we are creating a new historical record. The shortest time between the great calamities of civilization will no longer be 129,600,000 years, but 30,700,000 years. At this moment, a very old voice came from the mountain gate of the supreme mystery sect. It answered the question of the previous voice. Elder, you are right. Past experience can be used as a reference, but it cannot be completely shackled. I took it for granted. The previous voice sighed. It is good that you understand. The protagonist of this civilization catastrophe has now been born. Our sect was able to survive in the last civilization catastrophe because we were on good terms with the protagonist. This is our luck and our guidance. We can't miss out on this civilization calamity, the old voice said. We have already sent people to look for it. However, this civilization catastrophe seems to be a bit strange. There seems to be more than one protagonist, the first voice sighed. At this moment, a middle-aged man was standing on top of a high mountain in the mountain gate of the Taishan sect. This middle-aged man was the one who had spoken first. His cultivation was at the pinnacle of the immortal Tao. In other words, he was only a small step away, or even a thin piece of sandpaper, from becoming an itinerant immortal. However, his spirit and his cultivation had reached the peak of the true immortal realm. In terms of spirit and cultivation, he was even more powerful than the strongest cultivators from the two continents. The middle-aged man looked confused. He stood on a mountain and looked straight ahead. It was as if he could see through endless space and time to see things that were far away. At this moment, the void around the man slightly twisted. Countless strange lines were drawn in the void, forming a strange array in the blink of an eye. This array shook slightly, and light flashed. Endless yuan qi gathered in the surroundings. Then, an old man came through the air and appeared next to the middle-aged man. This old man looked extremely old. There were so many wrinkles on his skin that it made people feel that this somewhat thin old man was actually a 30-meter-tall giant. After this old man appeared, his eyes looked straight ahead like the middle-aged man. It was as if he was looking at something far away through endless distance. After a while, the old man sighed. I don't understand. I really don't understand. Our understanding of the great calamity of civilization is still too little. The great calamity of civilization is the calamity of every civilization. Even though it has been experienced so many times, even though there have been billions of calamities in the legends, everything related to the calamity has been annihilated in the great calamity after each calamity. In the end, the records left behind are fragmented and incomplete. It is impossible for us to truly understand the great calamity of civilization. Elder, now that you have come into contact with the Gate of Ascension, you can ascend at any time. Can't you see through the great calamity of civilization this time? The middle-aged man turned his head and said to the old man, Ascension is easier said than done. Even though I came into contact with the Gate of Ascension 30,000 years ago, I still haven't made any progress. Now, I only have short 3,000 years left to live. The possibility of ascension is getting smaller and smaller. My spirit has been gradually contaminated by this despair. It is impossible for me to see through the great calamity of civilization this time. The old man sighed. Chapter 1058. In a situation where the two were about the same level of cultivation, the old man's mind and realm were much stronger than the middle-aged man's. This was enough to form a crushing effect. In other words, even if the two of them were about the same level of cultivation, the old man could easily crush the middle-aged man with his own cultivation. He could make the middle-aged man unable to resist at all in front of him. As long as he thought about it, the middle-aged man would die in an instant, his body and soul destroyed. The middle-aged man was the sect leader of the Taishan sect. This old man was one of the elders of the Taishan sect, but he was the strongest and had the highest status. He was not someone the other elders could compare with. There are two main characters in the great calamity of the civilization. Let us work hard to find those two main characters and try to draw them into the sect together. After sighing for a while, the elder answered the sect leader's question. The elder's words make sense. Let's do this, the sect leader said with a sigh. The old man stood there for a while, then shook his head and sighed. I don't understand. I don't understand. Then he took a step forward, and countless strange lines flashed around his body, outlining a strange array. After a slight flash, the old man's figure disappeared without a trace. The sect leader immediately summoned the disciples of the sect and began to give a bunch of orders. The power of the Taishan sect began to spread out in two directions to find the so-called two main characters of the great calamity of the civilization. The great calamity of civilization was the calamity of civilization. It was a calamity born from heaven and earth, an unavoidable calamity. However, although it was born from heaven and earth, it had to happen because of people. Naturally, it needed to revolve around all living beings and use the hands of all living beings to create this calamity. And in such a calamity, among the living beings who caused the calamity, there was a main character of the calamity. This main character was either the source of the calamity, or it was the life of the calamity. If it was the source, then he would act as the fuse of the great calamity of the civilization, pointing out the great calamity. If it was the life of the civilization, then it meant that he was destined to not die in this great calamity of civilization. He was destined to be lucky, and he might even see the great calamity as the greatest opportunity, no matter what kind of main character he was. There were many benefits to having a good relationship with him. Even if he was the cause of the great calamity, forming a good relationship with him would greatly increase the original chances of survival. If he had the chance to survive the great tribulation, then there was no need to say anything more. Naturally, he would be able to obtain his protection and obtain a considerable amount of vitality, greatly increasing his safety during the great calamity. On this continent, the 36 great sects that were at the same level as the Supreme Mystery Sect all had similar movements. However, because of the difference in their respective realms, some of them could sense the existence of the two protagonists, while others could only sense one. Some of them didn't even sense it at all. They just wanted to follow behind the other sects and take advantage of them. As a result, the entire continent began to have conflicts that were far more intense than before. With the arrival of the great calamity, all living beings were fighting for their own lives. Naturally, it was completely different from fighting for benefits in the past. The main characters of the Great Tribulation that many sects were looking for were naturally the divine soul doppelgangers of Luo Fan and Battle God Sun. After all, the so-called civilization calamity was something that many sects thought would happen because of their appearance. In that case, it was obvious. As the root of this great calamity, they were considered the main characters of this great calamity. Although Luo Fan and Battle God Sun vaguely felt something at this time, they didn't feel that it was true, so they didn't bother to care. After Luo Fan was born, he lived like an ordinary baby for 3 years. After that, he began to show extraordinary talent for cultivation and began to step onto the path of cultivation. Although the power carried by this divine soul doppelganger of Luo Fan was negligible compared to him, but compared to ordinary creatures, it was terrifyingly powerful. Coupled with his own cultivation and his own comprehension when he began to cultivate, that speed was unimaginably fast. Normal people would have to cultivate from scratch. To reach the peak of the cultivation methods of this world, it would take at least thousands of years. But for Luo Fan, he could predict that he would definitely be able to reach the peak of the cultivation methods of this continent in just a dozen years. This was also because Luo Fan didn't wholeheartedly cultivate the cultivation methods of this continent. Instead, he was wholeheartedly trying to understand the various mysteries of the cultivation methods, experimenting with his various comprehensions of the cultivation methods, and searching for the fundamental principles of the cultivation methods. That was why it took so many years. Normally, 2 to 3 years would be enough for him to reach the peak of the cultivation methods of this world. 10 years after Luo Fan's divine soul doppelganger was born, Luo Fan's divine soul doppelganger had already cultivated to the level 9 of the mortal realm. Although it hadn't reached the peak, it was already considered to have stepped into the highest level before the path of immortality. It could be said that it had caught up to the level that living creatures of this world would normally need thousands of years to reach. At this moment, Luo Fan was sitting cross-legged in a quiet room with his eyes closed. The power in his body surged, and his body faintly emitted a mysterious aura. This kind of aura was connected to the boundless Yuan Qi in the outside world. It was connected to the aura that filled the entire continent that was extremely beneficial to the soul. It caused his body to constantly change between illusory and real. He seemed to be becoming more and more corporeal, becoming more and more compatible with the laws of this continent. Half an hour later, Luo Fan let out a long breath and opened his eyes. There seemed to be two universes in his eyes, and there seemed to be countless galaxies revolving in them. There's actually the mysteries of ascension behind this cultivation method. Looks like it was really worth it for my clone to reincarnate this time. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The cultivation method that he was currently cultivating was publicly acknowledged as the most powerful and exquisite cultivation method on this continent. The name of the cultivation method was very impressive. It was called the Heavenly Scripture of Chaos Unification. It was said to have been created by an ancient deity, and after cultivating it, it could even cause the heavens and earth to collapse, turning the world into chaos. The reason why Luo Fan could cultivate this cultivation method was very simple. It was because his main body had directly compared all the cultivation methods on this continent with his senses and directly selected them before passing them on to his soul clone. This did not seem to be in line with the normal rules, as if he had activated his golden finger too much. However, one must not forget that Luo Fan had split his soul and reincarnated on this continent, not to enjoy the wonderful life after transmigrating, but to search for the principles and mysteries of this continent's cultivation methods, and to find things that were useful to his main body. If that was the case, so what if he activated his golden finger into a golden thigh? The gate of ascension. I wonder where I'll go after ascending. Could it be that what is hidden in this Taoist field is the place where I'll go after ascending? Luo Fan thought to himself. After personally cultivating the heavenly scripture of chaos unification for 10 years, Luo Fan had gradually understood the truth of the cultivation system on this continent. He had already faintly sensed the gate of ascension, which could only be sensed by other living beings on this continent when they had cultivated their hearts and realms to the golden, immortal realm. Although he could not see the gate of ascension clearly, nor could he open it, he already knew that it was a real existence, based on his senses. However, he could not find where the gate of ascension led at all. Even if he shifted to the perspective of his main body, with the extraordinary vision brought by his Tao Master Realm, he could not see where the gate of ascension might lead to after ascending, nor could he find out which continent it was or which space-time was connected to this continent. It could guide powerful practitioners to ascend. If this continent wants to ascend, it must cut off all karma, whether it's with the family, with others, or with the heaven and earth. If one cultivates painstakingly, even if his spiritual realm is cultivated to the primordial unity pure yang level, he still can't open the gate of ascension. Luo Fan's knowledge was beyond imagination. Although he could not see where the space-time after ascension was, he could deduce the conditions to open the gate of ascension from the cultivation method. He understood that to find the heaven and earth after ascension, he could not do closed-door cultivation. It was easy to cut off the karma between people. Luo Fan's divine soul doppelganger had been cultivating wholeheartedly for the past 10 years and did not have many karma entanglements with people. Even with the family and the parents of this divine soul doppelganger, he was quite indifferent. In this way, to cut off the karma between people, it was not difficult. He only needed to give some benefits to the family, so that the family could grow and exist for a long time, so that the parents of this doppelganger could live a satisfied life and finally die of old age in peace. That would be considered as the karma between the family and the parents. As for the karma of servants and friends, it was much easier to end it. He only needed to give some benefits or give some punishment. What made him feel a little troubled was the cause and effect of heaven and earth. Living beings were born between heaven and earth, and they were constantly receiving the grace of heaven and earth. It was heaven and earth. It was the heaven and earth that produced countless yuan qi to sustain the survival of living beings. It was the heaven and earth that produced countless food for living beings to eat. It was the heaven and earth that displayed endless mysteries for living beings to cultivate. It was the heaven and earth that protected living beings from all kinds of dangers and harm. It was the earth that gave living beings a place to stand. It was the sun, moon, and stars that gave living beings light, and so on and so forth. If he wanted to repay all these favors and end all these karma, then the difficulty could naturally be imagined. Since I have received the grace of heaven and earth, I naturally have to repay this grace. Only then can I leave heaven and earth and ascend. Throughout the history of this continent, there have been very few cultivators who have ascended. Perhaps it is because it is difficult to repay the kindness of heaven and earth. Luo Fan sighed. The best way to repay the kindness of heaven and earth was to give the kindness of heaven and earth. In other words, one had to do enough things that were beneficial to heaven and earth in order to repay the kindness. According to some cultivation books, doing things that were beneficial to heaven and earth was to obtain merit. Merit. I have to start looking for merit. Luo Fan stood up and walked out of the quiet room. There was a strong man sitting cross-legged at the door. This strong man was 12 feet tall, and he looked like a small mountain sitting there. His name was Han Er, and he was Luo Fan's bodyguard, follower, and bodyguard. He had been with Luo Fan since he was a child. His current strength was roughly equivalent to a level 5 mortal realm cultivator. Right now, he was sitting here to protect Luo Fan. When Han Er saw Luo Fan coming out, he smiled and stood up. "Young master, you've come out of seclusion. Yes, the weather's good today. I can't waste it all on cultivation. Come shopping with me." "Young master," Luo Fan said with a smile. Han Er was overjoyed and kept nodding. Luo Fan smiled and walked out of the manor with Han Er. The family that Luo Fan's soul clone reincarnated into was surnamed Qian. They were the main family of a large family in this area. The Qian family was quite powerful. At least for the people in this area, they were quite powerful. The strongest person in the family was a cultivator whose strength was roughly equivalent to a level 6 mortal realm cultivator. A level 6 mortal realm cultivator had already cultivated 2/3 of the known cultivation methods on this continent. This shocking strength was enough to frighten many living beings within a radius of tens of thousands of miles. This was the identity of Luo Fan's reincarnation. He was the eldest young master of the Qian family. He was also the only son of the Qian family's patriarch. Since he was a child, he had lived a luxurious life and enjoyed almost all the riches in the world. He also had all kinds of cultivation resources. Even the disciples of some cultivation sects could not compare to him. On the street, passers-by who saw him from afar bowed carefully. After Luo Fan left, they continued to do what they were doing. This was the majesty of the Qian family. Anyone within a radius of tens of thousands of miles had to be this respectful and obedient as long as they did not want to die. Luo Fan was already used to this. He completely ignored it and just strolled around with Han Er. "Han Er, did anything new happen these few days?" Luo Fan asked casually as he enjoyed the sunny and warm weather. "Something new? I wonder if Suehong Brothel's new top girl counts?" Han Er said with a silly smile. "Suehong Brothel's new top girl? Han Er, do you know how old I am?" Luo Fan said helplessly. "You're already 11 years old in nominal age. Have you forgotten, young master?" Han Er continued to smile. "Then tell me, for an 11-year-old kid, what does Suehong Brothel's new top girl have to do with me? Why do you think this is something new?" Luo Fan slapped Han Er's thigh. He said angrily. The reason why he slapped Han Er's thigh was because Han Er was too tall, and he himself was only about 1.4 meters tall. If it was convenient, he would only be able to hit the buttocks. This was obviously too ambiguous. In comparison, he could only hit Han Er's thigh. "Oh, that seems to be the case." Han Er chuckled. Han Er rubbed the back of his head. As for Luo Fan's slap on his thigh, he did not feel it at all. "Other than this, what else is new?" Luo Fan asked again, helplessly. "Other than this, there seems to be nothing else." "I don't think so." Han Er scratched the back of his head and furrowed his brows. It was obvious that he was thinking hard. "Oh, that's right. There seems to be something new." Han Er suddenly said with joy. "Oh, what is it?" Luo Fan asked curiously when he saw Han Er's sudden excitement. The Taishan sect, ranked 9th on the continent, came to our city 3 days ago for a 3-day recruitment test. In the end, they seem to have taken a fancy to 4 or 5 disciples of the Qian family and are taking them to Taishan sect today, Han Er said. Taishan sect? Recruiting disciples? Why haven't I heard of it? Luo Fan's knowledge was still there. When he heard this, he faintly felt that this matter had something to do with him. This is just a small matter. Master and Madam seemed to have said that joining Taishan sect would not benefit the young master. So they did not inform the young master, Han Er said. Luo Fan smiled helplessly, shook his head, and put this matter to the back of his mind. Perhaps Taishan sect had come here for him, but he did not have much interest in Taishan sect. What he wanted now was to do some good and return the karma of heaven and earth, and then return the karma of his parents and family, open the door to ascension, and find the fundamental principles of this continent's cultivation system. As for why Taishan sect had come to find him, and what would happen to him after they found him, it was meaningless to him. Naturally, he had heard about it. Let's go out of the city and take a look. I heard that not long ago, a large river outside the city changed its course and flooded several villages and tens of thousands of acres of fertile land. I wonder how it's been handled now? Luo Fan said, Young master, I'm just your guard. How would I know about these things? Han Er scratched his head and said to Luo Fan innocently, Stupid, if you don't know, why don't you ask? Luo Fan was furious and once again slapped Han Er's thigh, shouting, Oh! Han Er suddenly understood and said, I'll go ask right away. Young master, you wait here. After saying that, he did not wait for Luo Fan to speak and directly ran away in a hurry. This idiot, Luo Fan, shook his head helplessly. Looking at a fortune-telling stall on the side of the road, he directly ran to the fortune-telling stall and sat down. Young Master Qian, your life is very rich and noble, a life of great fortune. There is no need to read it at all. Young master, please don't make fun of this old man. The fortune-teller was an old man with white eyes. As soon as Luo Fan sat down, he stood up in a panic and repeatedly bowed with his hands clasped in front of him. I'm not here to have my fortune read. I'm just sitting here to rest for a while. You continue to pretend to be blind. Don't worry about me, Luo Fan said disdainfully. Yes. Young master can sit as long as you want, the old man hurriedly and carefully said as he sat down. However, Luo Fan did not need to look to know what he was thinking. If you sit here, who would dare to come here to have their fortunes read? Young master of the Qian family, we are just commoners. Even if we take one more look at you, I'm afraid that our lives will be shortened. Those who dare to sit with you are either stupid and bold, or idiots. How unlucky. I originally thought that there would be more people here, so there would be more business. I didn't expect to encounter such bad luck, Sai. Chapter 1059. After waiting for more than an hour, Han Er hurriedly rushed back from afar. He said to Luo Fan, Young master, I found out. It's really tragic. Those 8 villages are still in the middle of the ocean. Tens of thousands of corpses have been found downstream. I heard that the number of corpses that haven't been found is even greater. It seems that the number of fertile farmland that has been submerged is not just 10,000 mu, but more than 100,000 mu. Luo Fan could not help but frown when he heard this. He had heard about the change of the river's course a few days ago. He originally thought that it must have been taken care of long ago, but why was it still like this now? To turn the river's course back again might be extremely difficult for ordinary people, but for cultivators at the 5th or 6th level of the mortal realm, it was a rather simple task. They could do it after spending a few days of cultivation. Even so, no one actually did anything about it. This was really somewhat unreasonable. I see. I think they all regard the common people as ants, and they're not even willing to spend a few days of cultivation for them. Luo Fan sighed and stood up. He left the fortune-telling stall under the blind fortune-teller's attentive service. All right, let me see the merit on this continent. It's not the same as I imagined, Luo Fan thought as he led Han Er out of the city. Young master, that blind fortune-teller is a fake. On the way, Han Er could not help but say after holding back for a long time, If even you know, how can I not know? Luo Fan slapped Han Er's thigh and reprimanded him. "Oh, so young master knows." Hee hee. Han Er seemed to have come to a sudden realization and laughed foolishly. "Since young master knows, why are you still hanging out with this kind of swindler? If master sees this, he might not be happy." "Swindler? That's not necessarily true." Luo Fan did not explain too much and chuckled. On the surface, the blind fortune teller looked like an ordinary swindler, but Luo Fan could tell at a glance that he was an expert. At the very least, he was at the peak of this continent. His cultivation had reached the peak of the immortal Tao, and his mental state had reached the level of a golden immortal. If such an existence wanted to show his might, not to mention this city, even the land within 10,000 miles of the Qian clan would be destroyed in an instant. Such an existence, calling him a charlatan, it could be said that they had eyes but failed to see. It was precisely because of this blind fortune teller's background. That was why Luo Fan was interested in talking a few more words with him and teasing him. Otherwise, even if Luo Fan didn't discriminate against him, he wouldn't care too much. Han Er, however, did not know this. He looked at Luo Fan's confident look, scratching the back of his head. He finally gave up thinking about this behavior that was not suitable for him. "No matter what, I've already reminded him. Young master said so. It has nothing to do with me, even if the old master blames me," Han Er thought with a chuckle. The two of them were extremely fast. Although the river that had changed course outside the city was quite a distance away from the city, it only took them an hour to cross it with their speed. Soon, Luo Fan and Han Er arrived at a mountain peak next to the river that had changed course. Below the mountain peak was a vast expanse of water. A few days ago, this place was still a plain. There were large tracts of fertile farmland and wastelands waiting to be reclaimed. There were also several villages that could almost be considered towns. Now, however, there was nothing left except the vast expanse of water. The calm water reflected the surrounding mountains, and the scenery was quite pleasant. Only the occasional animal or human corpses that floated past completely destroyed this pleasant scenery, causing those who saw this scene to feel a chill down their spines. Luo Fan stood on the mountain peak and stared at the source of the vast expanse of water. Dozens of miles away, the high ground that had originally blocked the river had suddenly caved in due to some unknown force. The river had changed its course and flowed into this plain, causing such a terrifying disaster. If we build a dam, we should be able to change the river's course again. However, even if it's changed, it'll only make the cultivated land return. The people who died, the submerged villages, and the losses are still losses. Luo Fan sighed. The vast expanse of water made a turn not far downstream and turned back into the river. The entire process was as if the heavens were unhappy with this plain, so they purposely made the river turn and completely submerged the plain. "Let me see what merit is." Luo Fan sighed. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure disappeared in front of Han Er in an instant. Han Er was shocked. He called out young master," a few times, but the only response he got was his own echo. For a moment, he could not help but panic. Luo Fan naturally did not care about Han Er's reaction. His figure disappeared into thin air, and with a single step, he arrived at the entrance of the river's course. He hovered in the air and looked down at the rapid flow of water at the entrance. The cultivation level of this spirit clone of his was only at the 9th level of the mortal realm. If he was an ordinary cultivator born on this mainland, such a cultivation level would indeed allow him to possess many incredible abilities, but it would definitely not allow him to do all these things so effortlessly. However, he was clearly not an ordinary cultivator at the 9th level of the worldly realm. His heart and his cultivation base had reached an unimaginable level. Although this level was not the level he had reached with his current cultivation method, it was still high enough for him to do many things that ordinary cultivators of this level could not do. If one had to compare, the current Luo Fan, with just this spirit clone, was enough to crush the blind fortune teller. Even the elder of the Supreme Mystery Sect would not be able to resist him. At this moment, Luo Fan stood in the air with his invisibility. He carefully observed the terrain below, looking for the source of the collapse of the high ground. This was not simple. At least, with the restrictions of Luo Fan's current cultivation level, it was not simple. After a long while, Luo Fan finally saw what was going on and could not help but frown. The cause of the collapse of the high ground was a change more than 43,000 miles underground. There was a strange beast curled up. This strange beast was not big. From the looks of it, it was only 10 feet tall. Around it, there were countless small cracks spreading out. It seemed that this strange beast had done something and broken through the surrounding ground, thus creating such cracks. This strange beast was a fish-shaped strange beast. At this moment, there was no aura of life at all, but he couldn't be any more dead. Around this strange beast, there were faint strands of black fog. This black fog was very strange. It was not an ordinary black fog, but an existence that seemed to be a kind of soul power. One could faintly see tens of thousands of faces struggling and howling within. They were cursing. Just looking at this black fog, it would naturally produce a feeling that one was sinking, the feeling of falling into the abyss. As soon as Luo Fan saw this, he knew that this was a kind of karma, or rather, it was the karma on this continent, an existence that was completely opposite to merit. So that's how it is. Luo Fan's mind moved, and he raised his hand and waved. In an instant, there was a mysterious power that directly passed through the tens of thousands of miles of ground, directly arriving at where the fish-shaped strange beast was, and directly grabbed a strand of black fog. After the black fog was grabbed by this power, it shook slightly, as if it was frantically struggling, but also as if it could not break free from the fish-shaped strange beast. Luo Fan frowned slightly. The moment his power touched the karma, he felt countless curses, wails, and hatred suddenly surging into his mind through that power. Those curses, wails, and hatred were overwhelming, trying to corrode his mind and will, wanting to pull his mind and will directly become one of the countless curses, wails, and hatred. What a terrifying karma! With his outstanding realm, Luo Fan suddenly struggled, and his mind and will suddenly became round like a golden core. No matter how the wails, curses, and hatred invaded him, he did not waver, and was no longer affected by the karma. This was something that only people like Luo Fan, who had reached an unimaginably high realm, could do. For ordinary living beings on this continent, karma was the most powerful poison, and even a glance at it could cause great damage to them. If one's power touched the karma, it was equivalent to suicide, and they would definitely not be able to escape from its corrosion. They would be completely assimilated by the karma. Although their souls would not be destroyed, it was not much better than that, and they would become an existence that was neither human nor ghost. Of course, there were some exceptions. For example, if a person with karma like Jiechu was an existence with great merit, then the merit that he existed could offset the karma, allowing him to escape from the damage of karma. However, it was absolutely impossible for him to be like Luo Fan, who was able to easily break free from the pull of karma and the erosion of karma. Luo Fan's eyes narrowed, and the power that grabbed the traces of karma suddenly trembled. It instantly passed through the ground that was tens of thousands of miles away and arrived before him. Faced with the karma that ordinary cultivators feared like a tiger, he acted like he was facing an ordinary black fog. He directly raised his right hand and grabbed the karma in his hand. At the instant the karma entered his hand, he felt that the boundless curses, rage, and curses he endured in his mind had become countless times stronger. These voices crazily attacked his mind, and the corrosive force suddenly increased by more than 100 times. However, in the face of Luo Fan's mind, which had become as round as a golden core, such a corrosive force was like a waterfall encountering a reef. Although the momentum was extremely shocking, it did not cause the slightest damage to the reef. The reef was still eternally fixed in place, not affected in the slightest. So this is karma. Luo Fan carefully observed the trace of karma in his hand and sighed inexplicably after a long time. The trace of karma was not ordinary energy, nor was it ordinary matter. Instead, it was something that was formed by the combination of countless laws. Its existence was completely connected to the laws of the entire mainland, and it was even connected to the laws of the entire mainland. It was so tough that it could not be destroyed at all unless the entire mainland was destroyed. Luo Fan casually slapped, and waves of mysterious power surged out of his hand. It directly entered the trace of karma and the gaps between the structure of the laws of karma. It continuously shook and cracked in an attempt to disintegrate the structure of the laws of karma. In the end, he realized that no matter what he did, even if he had completely grasped the weakness of the laws of karma and completely destroyed the structure of the laws of karma, the laws of karma would condense again as long as his power left, and it would still be the same as before. It was still the same structure of karma that could cause all living beings to sink. It seems like, if you want merit, you have to do it according to the rules of this continent. Luo Fan sighed and gently loosened his hand, causing the bad karma to fall down. The karma fell a few feet down. It suddenly disappeared without a trace. At the instant it disappeared, the same karma appeared around the body of the strange beast that was tens of thousands of kilometers underground. Clearly, at that moment, the karma was the result of the laws of this mainland. It easily crossed the void and returned to its original position. The reason why Luo Fan said that was because although merit and karma were completely opposite, they corresponded to each other. In other words, the structure of merit should belong to the same category as karma. In this way, if he could study the structure of the karma, he would be able to roughly deduce the structure of merit. After deducing the structure of merit, he would naturally be able to find a way to create such a structure and easily obtain enough merit. He would then use the merit to sever his karma with this world and finally find a way to open the gate of ascension. He would then enter the world behind the gate of ascension and get closer to the truth of this dojo. Unfortunately, from the perspective of the karma, although the structure of the karma and merit could be broken down and the structure did not seem very complicated, it was completely compatible with the laws of this mainland and the great Tao of this mainland. Therefore, unless he could directly go deep into the laws of this mainland and change them from the root, it was impossible to create the laws of these two structures. Obviously, when Luo Fan's strength was not suppressed, he might be able to do it easily and directly go deep into the laws of this mainland and change them. However, at that moment, not to mention his clone, even Luo Fan's strength was greatly suppressed, so it was impossible for him to do that. Therefore, it was obvious that he could not create his own merit. Because of this, Luo Fan let out such a sigh. It was no longer possible to cheat, so Luo Fan could only sigh and obediently seek merit according to the rules. With a slight thought, the power in his body was released and directly rushed out of his body, turning into an invisible and intangible existence. It turned into thousands of chain-like existences that continuously drilled into the river below and continued to penetrate deep into the ground, turning into a huge three-dimensional network that covered the entire bottom layer within a radius of several kilometers. The entrance of the river that had changed its course was extremely wide, and it was several kilometers wide. Outside of this several kilometers was still the highland from before, so it looked like there was a huge gap in the highland. The power cultivated by Luo Fan's spirit clone was a kind of power that contained almost all attributes and was of an extremely high quality. Not only was this power tough and solid, but it was also ever-changing. It had various magical effects that other cultivation methods on this mainland did not have. Luo Fan controlled the thousands of strands of power that had split out of his body. His eyes narrowed, and in an instant, all of the power began to move at the same time. In an instant, an indescribably terrifying lifting force erupted from the three-dimensional network formed by the thousands of strands of power, gradually lifting the bottom layer within a radius of several kilometers and several kilometers underground. Although Luo Fan's current cultivation level was only equivalent to the 9th level of the mortal realm, his current strength was very weak. After all, the 9th level of the mortal realm was a realm that was close to the way of immortals. It was naturally too exaggerated for such a realm to destroy the world, but it was no problem for him to overturn mountains and seas. The weight of the ground within a radius of several kilometers and several kilometers underground added up to an astronomical amount, but to him, it was only slightly strenuous. At this moment, when he raised the ground, the weight was secondary. What caused him some trouble was how to fix the ground after raising it. After all, if the ground was raised thousands of meters high, there would naturally be an additional gap that was thousands of meters wide below it. If he did not make corresponding arrangements and allowed these gaps to exist, then the raised ground would probably fall again soon. When that happened, it would also be the result of the river changing course. In this way, not to mention bringing merit to Luo Fan, even if the negative karma didn't pull him into complete depravity, he would be able to secretly laugh. Luo Fan frowned and pondered. He controlled his power to constantly move the surrounding ground, so that the gap left after the ground was raised was gradually filled by the surrounding soil. He did his best to prevent the gap from becoming too large after the ground was raised. In this way, it was not very difficult, but it made the speed at which he raised the ground extremely slow. The entire process lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Chapter 1060. When Luo Fan used tens of thousands of forces to raise the ground to block the gap, the vast ocean that had been submerged by the river began to gradually change. Because the terrain was gradually rising, the depth of the gap became smaller and smaller, causing the speed at which the water flowed in to become slower and slower. And the final result of this slowing down was that the flow of the water in the vast ocean became no longer calm. Downstream, the river began to gradually become unable to keep up, and the depth of the entire ocean began to gradually decrease. This was not the only change. Other than this vast ocean, the surrounding land was emitting waves of buzzing sounds. It was as if an extremely weak but continuous earthquake was occurring. This kind of change naturally could not be hidden from others. Within 3 days, many cultivators had arrived at the various mountain peaks beside the vast ocean. Among these cultivators, other than the cultivators of the Qian family, the most eye-catching was the cultivators of the Supreme Mystery Sect who had yet to leave. 3 days ago, the cultivators of the Supreme Mystery Sect had originally planned to leave this small border city after recruiting enough disciples. However, they did not expect such an incredible change to suddenly occur here. It was as if the heavens and earth had turned upside down, showing a kind of magic that seemed to have been created by nature. This kind of incredible scene was a great opportunity for cultivators. How could they leave this place at such a time? 10 days ago, this highland suddenly caved in out of nowhere, causing the river to change its course. It caused the people to be plunged into misery and suffering. It has only been a few dozen days, but this highland is actually recovering. Just what is going on? Within the Supreme Mystery Sect, a young man frowned and said, "Senior brother, the people of this plane must have done something to offend the heavens. Otherwise, it would not have been like this." Beside him, a woman frowned and said, whether it was the young man or the woman, they both had an elegant charm to them. Standing on top of the mountain, it was as if they could fly away with the wind at any time, transcending the mortal world. Although there were only 2 of them, they occupied a mountain peak. On this mountain peak, no one else dared to approach at all. This was an empty scene on top of a mountain. It formed a huge contrast with the densely packed appearance of the other mountains. From this, it could be seen just how powerful the Supreme Mystery Sect, one of the 3 great sects, was. Even the Qian family could not be compared to these 2 ordinary disciples from the Taishan sect. Qian Jin's mountain peak wasn't just filled with cultivators from the Qian clan. Apart from the cultivators of the Qian clan, the cultivators of the big clans and forces in this area were all on the same mountain peak as them. Punished by the heavens? Is this how cultivators like us should think? The young man frowned and said, "Even though we cultivators have to revere the heavens and the earth, we can't blindly believe in the heavens and the earth." "Senior brother is right," the woman said with a serious expression. The young man nodded in satisfaction and said no more. On another mountain, "Han Air, have you found the young master yet?" A skinny middle-aged man asked the man beside him. Judging from the old man's aura, he was at the 6th level of the worldly realm. This level of cultivation was already the highest level among all the cultivators on the mountain peaks. Even the 2 cultivators from the Supreme Mystery Sect were 1 level higher than him, only equivalent to the 5th level of the worldly realm. This man was named Qian Tong, and he was the reincarnated father of Luo Fan's soul clone. He was also the current patriarch of the Qian clan, the ruling family in this area. Qian Tong was surrounded by more than a dozen cultivators whose strength was at least at the 4th level of the worldly realm. Among them was this big man, who was Luo Fan's attendant, bodyguard, Han Er. Han Er's eyes were red at this time, and his body exuded an anxious aura. His whole person was like a barrel of gunpowder, almost igniting at the slightest provocation. When he heard Qian Tong's question, he panted a few times, then said anxiously, "No, I can't find where the young master went at all. I've searched thousands of miles around, but no one has seen the young master." Oomph. When Qian Tong heard Han Er say this, he coldly snorted, and the aura on his body fluctuated violently, almost bursting out. Fortunately, he was, after all, the patriarch of a clan, so his self-control was naturally not too bad. Although he was anxious and very worried about his son, he was still able to barely maintain his composure, and his aura was once again restrained into nothingness. Continue to search for him. If you can't find him within thousands of miles, then expand the search to the entire territory. If you can't find him within the territory, then go out of the territory. No matter what, you must find the young master, he said indifferently. Although he forced himself to appear indifferent, his voice clearly contained an extremely suppressed anger. Yes. Han Er hurriedly cupped his fists and bowed, then turned around and hurried down the mountain. "Qilin, where the hell did you go now? You better not have been plotted against. If you really have been plotted against, then I will definitely uproot the family that plotted against you." At this time, such a thought flashed through Qian Tong's mind. On a certain mountain peak, an old fortune-teller who pretended to be blind was leaning against a large rock, his white eyes staring at the vast ocean in front of him, paying attention to the slightly rising ground. Just what kind of power caused the ground to rise? Just who could have done all this? Even I can't find any traces of it. Could this be the doing of the main character of the great calamity of civilization? That shouldn't be the case. As the main character of the great calamity of civilization, no one is invincible as soon as they appear. If they're invincible as soon as they appear, then where did the great calamity come from? All sorts of thoughts flashed through the blind fortune-teller's mind. However, even though his mind was in a mess, the old man's expression still maintained the kind of shocked expression that an ordinary person would have upon seeing such a scene. On the mountain peak that the old man was on, not everyone was a cultivator. There were also many bold, ordinary people. These ordinary people were currently filled with shock just like the old man. This was a scene of heaven and earth changing. To ordinary people like them, this was a kind of miracle that could not be seen even once in thousands of years. Naturally, they were shocked and pious. In fact, there were even many people who kept kowtowing to the vast ocean, calling out the names of various gods that existed and did not exist, praying for the gods to take pity on their tragic fate, praying for the gods to bless them with good weather and good harvests every year. Only an extremely small number of ordinary people had pained expressions on their faces, as if they were in grief and pain. These people, they were the relatives of the villagers in the few villages that were submerged by the river. Perhaps they were friends with someone in the village. Perhaps they were born in one of the villages, or perhaps they were villagers who just happened to leave the village when it was submerged because they had something to do. For people like them, the changes in the vast ocean would only remind them of how the river had changed its course and completely submerged the land where their ancestors had lived. For people like them, the changes in the vast ocean would only remind them of how the river had changed its course and completely submerged the land where their ancestors had lived for generations. It would completely wipe out a few villages. In fact, some of the more extreme individuals even began to feel resentment toward heaven and earth. They would not think that the current changes were a gift from the heavens. They would only think that the previous changes were a disaster for them. When they saw the changes before their eyes, they would only wonder why the current changes had not happened before. They would only wonder why the changes had appeared so late. They wanted their relatives, friends, and family to completely disappear within a day, turning into a vast ocean. Of course, the ordinary people who had connections with the villages below were not all the same. They were merely a very small portion of the ordinary people who had various connections with the villages below. After all, not everyone had the convenience or the courage to come here. Luo Fan had long since expected this kind of effect from his actions. It was precisely because of this that he had concealed himself, making it seem like his actions were completely natural. It was impossible to tell where he was at all. However, even though this was what he expected, it did not affect his will at all. He floated in the air and did his best to carry out the process of lifting the ground. The entire process was extremely slow, but there was still an end to it. When the sun finally rose from the horizon on the fourth day and began to shine on the entire continent, a strange rumble suddenly rang out from the gap. In an instant, it spread through the land within a radius of several thousand kilometers, causing the expressions of the many living beings on the mountains around the ocean to change drastically. Although their expressions also changed drastically, some were filled with anticipation, some were filled with shock, some were filled with joy, and some were filled with hatred and anger. There were all kinds of emotions. As the rumble rang out, the gap finally disappeared completely. The high ground that had sunken and finally returned to its original state more than a dozen days ago. The river that had been continuously flowing down from the high ground could no longer flow out of the river due to the high ground's complete recovery. It could no longer form a water curtain that covered the high ground. The appearance of the high ground appeared in the eyes of many living beings. The moment they saw the high ground, cries of surprise came from the mouths of most of the living beings on the mountains. Fortune lies within disaster, and disaster lies within fortune. It's nothing more than this, nothing more than this. The old fortune teller let out a long sigh. The high ground shone with golden light under the sunlight. This golden light did not come from the high ground shining. Instead, countless golden substances had appeared on the surface of the high ground that had been submerged by the river for more than a dozen days. These golden substances were densely packed together. Almost every single one of them was a thumb-sized piece of gold. The golden light came from the sun shining on them and shining with a golden luster. The currency used on this continent was also the precious metal currency system. Gold was an extremely precious metal on this continent, and its value was dozens of times more precious than in the outside world. This large piece of land that was several miles long was densely covered with thumb-sized gold. If all of them were collected, not to mention the few villages and large tracts of fertile land, it would be more than enough to buy the city where the Qian clan was located. From this point of view, the change of the river's course was a great thing for the nearby residents. It was because of this that there were such cries of surprise. It was also because of this that the blind fortune teller let out a sigh. Gold, gold. Cries of surprise echoed among the many mountains. Even cultivators could not calm down at this moment. The cultivation system on this continent focused more on cultivating the mind. Even if there were external items that could help cultivate the mind, they were extremely rare and precious. They were not things that ordinary cultivators could obtain. Thus, for the cultivators on this continent, they were not much different from ordinary people. Gold, a precious metal that was extremely valuable to ordinary people, was just as precious to them. Their emotions would also greatly change for the sake of this precious metal. In front of them, there was an area of several kilometers, densely packed pieces of gold. To them, this was enough to make them go crazy. On top of a mountain peak, Qian Tong saw the changes in the high ground, and his expression changed greatly. This plain is the territory of our Qian family. Our Qian family will not monopolize the gold. Half. Our Qian family only want half. This line will be the boundary. If anyone dares to take the gold on the left, that will be an enemy of our Qian family. The Qian family will not rest until one of us is dead. As for the gold on the right, anyone can take it." Qian Tong shouted. Saying this, he raised his hand. A ray of golden light shot out from his back and paused above his head. Then, with an unimaginable speed, it rushed toward the newly formed high ground. In the blink of an eye, it left a long mark in the middle of the high ground. After this mark appeared, golden light flashed, forming a long curtain of light that rose directly into the sky. After rising 10 meters from the ground, it suddenly turned and wrapped around the left side. In the blink of an eye, it formed a light barrier over the high ground, directly covering the ground on the left side of the mark. After doing this, Qian Tong's expression didn't change in the slightest, but a trace of exhaustion flashed in his eyes. Obviously, with his strength at the 6th level of the mortal realm, it was a bit difficult for him to produce such a light barrier to cover the high ground several kilometers in diameter from such a long distance. However, although it was a bit difficult, he still managed to do it. All the cultivators who saw this scene had their expressions change greatly. Some of the thoughts they had originally had were instantly extinguished. After all, Qian Tong was an existence equivalent to a 6th level mortal realm cultivator. In this area, he was already the strongest existence. Now that he had produced such a light barrier to cover the high ground, this kind of strength was enough to shock all of them, making it impossible for them to have any thoughts of fighting Qian Tong. Qian Tong raised his hand, and the golden light he had shot out turned around in the distance and quickly rushed back. After a while, it reappeared behind him and merged back into his body. Good. Since the Qian family is so righteous, we are all grateful. A shout came from somewhere. Following that, silhouettes flickered on the mountain peaks. One after another, the silhouettes displayed all sorts of wondrous techniques and used all sorts of magic tools to quickly head towards the highland filled with gold. In the blink of an eye, the originally peaceful atmosphere disappeared, replaced by a predictable storm of blood. Master is wise. If Master insisted on monopolizing this gold, he would definitely make all the cultivators attack him. At that time, no matter how strong the Qian family is, I'm afraid they wouldn't be able to withstand it. Now that we've occupied half of it, leaving the other half for them to fight over, it's just right. An old man beside Qian Tong said to Qian Tong with great admiration. Unfortunately, if it weren't for the fact that our Qian family's strength isn't enough, how could we have given up on this half of the gold? Qian Tong shook his head and sighed. Then, he issued a lot of orders and began to mobilize the Qian family's forces to rush over here. He wanted to collect the gold as soon as possible. Although the Qian family's strength was here, and no cultivator would be crazy enough to attack the other half of the gold, they couldn't stop some cultivators from going crazy and disregarding everything else. Therefore, the best thing to do was to collect the gold as soon as possible. What a good Qian clan. They're decisive and aren't blinded by benefits. On another mountain peak, the old fortune teller shook his head and sighed in admiration. Qian Tong's decision was so fast that even he couldn't help but admire him. It had to be known that although Qian Tong had casually drawn a line, it represented giving up nearly half of the city's worth of wealth. Even if the Qian family wanted to accumulate such wealth, it would take them hundreds of years to accumulate such wealth. But at this moment, Qian Tong had casually drawn a line and completely abandoned it. This kind of decisiveness was not something an ordinary person could do. However, he's smart enough to make a quick decision. Otherwise, if he had been a bit slower, everyone might have completely wiped out the Qian family's forces here before fighting over the gold. The old fortune teller sighed in admiration for a while before thinking about it with some regret. Thinking about it, the old man put on a helpless expression and said, "It's a pity such things can only be seen by mortals like us. We can't touch them at all. Let's go, lest we become more irritated." With that said, he turned around and began to walk down the mountain. Many of the mortals around him had bloodshot eyes and were almost unable to suppress their desire to follow the cultivators to the high ground to fight for the gold. However, after hearing the old man's words, many of them shuddered and the redness in their eyes faded significantly. Chapter 1061. Of course, There were many people who were bold and wanted to try their luck. Most of them came to their senses after hearing the old fortune teller's words. They knew that gold was not something they could touch. However, there were also quite a few who were brave enough to try their luck. They held the thought of seeking riches amidst danger, and their eyes were bloodshot. Some of them even looked at the old fortune teller as if he was a fool. This tribulation is fated to happen. It's not something that can be changed by humans. The old fortune teller thought to himself when he saw their reactions. He shook his head and slowly descended the mountain. Many ordinary mortals next to the old fortune teller followed him down the mountain. While the onlookers were going crazy over the sudden appearance of the gold, Luo-fan was still hovering in midair. At this moment, he was still invisible, although there were many living beings around him, including the old fortune teller, who was a level 9 mortal realm cultivator and a golden immortal. None of them were able to detect his presence. He didn't care about what was happening down below. As for the gold that was driving so many cultivators crazy, it was like a speck of dust to him. He didn't care about it at all. For someone who could create universes and worlds at will, he could obtain anything that existed in the outside world with just a thought. Naturally, he didn't care about anything else. After a long time, Luo-fan let out a long sigh. Such a thought flashed through his mind. So this is merit. As soon as this thought flashed through his mind, he made a grabbing motion. In an instant, a strange golden light appeared out of nowhere in his hand. This golden light was very wondrous. It gave off a peaceful and comfortable aura. Anyone who saw this golden light would feel a sense of comfort and want to take it for themselves. This golden light was none other than the merit that Luo-fan had obtained after mending the gap in the river that had been diverted. Although it was golden, it only appeared that way in Luo-fan's eyes. To others, it didn't exist at all. Not even the old fortune teller. He couldn't see it at all. This was merit. Just like karma, it was also an existence formed from various laws and laws. However, the laws and laws contained within it were practically the complete opposite of karma. That negative karma corroded living beings. It pulled the souls of living beings into a boundless abyss. They would never be able to reincarnate. Merit, on the other hand, was different. It contained a type of protection, a type of refinement. With this merit, it was equivalent to being protected by the entire world. It was equivalent to being cleansed and refined by the world at all times. It was easy to imagine how great the benefits were. Unfortunately, this little bit of merit is truly too little. It's far from enough to repay the karma of this world. Luo-fan sighed and released the merit. In an instant, the golden light shook violently and pounced towards his back. As the golden light pounced on his back, a faintly discernible golden wheel of light appeared behind his head. This wheel of light was very complete and holy. Under the illumination of this wheel of light, Luo-fan looked like a legendary god. One look at him would make one feel reverent and fearful. In the eyes of others, this kind of merit was already shocking. It was almost enough for them to become the darling of the heavens and the earth. They could trip over magic treasures while walking, eat grains that greatly increased their strength, and even drink bejeweled nectar when drinking water. All of these things were definitely not impossible. However, for Luo-fan, this kind of merit was just so. This kind of good luck was naturally very beneficial to the ordinary living beings of this land. It would allow them to have better opportunities and allow them to go further on the path of cultivation. However, to Luo-fan, this was nothing. With his cultivation level, external things were not of much use to him. What he needed was to repay the karma of this world and find a way to open the door of ascension. However, this amount of merit was just a drop in the bucket for this. It was still extremely far from being enough to truly settle the karma with the world. As he sighed, the golden wheel of light behind Luo-fan gradually disappeared. He turned his head and looked down. In an instant, a bloody battle entered his eyes. He saw that half of the high ground below was currently covered by a light barrier, while the other half was currently occupied by hundreds of cultivators crazily fighting. There were cultivators being injured or killed at every moment. The water that had yet to recede from the high ground was gradually dyed red due to the fighting. The tragic scene made Luo Fan momentarily unable to react. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. With a sweep of his gaze and a slight sensing, he already knew the truth of the matter. He could not help but shake his head and sigh. The cultivation system is so wonderful, but the human heart is still the same as other worlds. There is no essential difference. It's really a pity for such a wonderful way of cultivation. Luo Fan sighed. The cultivation system on this continent cultivated the mind and the realm. Normally speaking, the higher one cultivated this cultivation method, the higher the realm of the mind would be, and the fainter the desire for external objects would be. Even if the gold below was like this, it shouldn't be much in the eyes of cultivators. But what happened at this moment was completely contrary to his speculation. These cultivators were completely the same as the cultivators of other worlds. In fact, their desires seemed to be even stronger than Luo Fan's. After all, the cultivators of other worlds wouldn't have such a reaction when they saw gold. They would only have such a reaction when they saw higher quality spirit stones, pills, magic tools, and the like. This must be Qian Tong's method. Sure enough, he is quite decisive. It seems that the Qian family may not need me to do much in the future to continue growing. With that thought, he raised his hand and gently grasped. In an instant, the many pieces of gold covered by the light shield suddenly trembled, then floated up and quickly condensed in the center. In a short time, they condensed into a sphere with a diameter of 10,000 feet in midair. A sphere with a diameter of 10,000 feet. Even an ordinary stone would be extremely shocking. Even an ordinary metal would be extremely shocking, causing one's heart to tremble and be dumbfounded. What's more, the sphere with a diameter of 10,000 feet that appeared here at this moment was clearly made of gold. Such a change instantly caused everyone who was originally fighting to stop and stare sluggishly at the huge golden sphere. Even the people of the Qian family were dumbfounded at this moment, not knowing what expression to use to express the shock in their hearts for a while. What's going on? How did such a sudden change happen? At this time, Qian Tong no longer had the domineering decisiveness from before. He had become an ordinary middle-aged man, standing there muttering to himself. How could this be? At this time, the old fortune-teller who had already reached the foot of the mountain was suddenly shocked. He could barely maintain his original disguise. He turned his head and looked at the huge golden sphere floating in midair. The golden sphere was a full 10,000 feet in diameter, and it was suspended in midair at least 5,000 feet above the ground. Although the mountain they were on wasn't low, it was only 1,000 or 2,000 feet. Therefore, although the old fortune-teller had already reached the foot of the mountain, he still couldn't see the golden sphere. But as soon as he turned his head, he easily saw the huge golden sphere through the gap on the side of the mountain. This old fortune-teller was a mortal realm level 9 cultivator. He could even feel the powerful existence of the Gate of Ascension. Compared to the many cultivators here at this time, he was countless times more powerful. Perhaps the others were just shocked by the changes at this time and felt a little confused. But he saw more things, and at the same time, he was even more shocked. Condensing so much gold into a large sphere was actually something he could do, but after doing so, he would have to rest for a long time, and the power in his body would definitely be greatly depleted. Moreover, after lifting it up, the sphere would even sway, as if it could collapse and fall at any time. But what was happening before his eyes was completely different. The huge ball of gold floated in midair as if it was directly fixed in the air. The stability, ease, and freedom it gave off were things that even 100 of him couldn't achieve. On top of that, the cultivator who did all of this was still hidden in the void. He did not reveal himself at all. What did this mean? It clearly meant that doing all this was as easy as turning over a hand for that person, and he didn't need to expend too much energy at all. And this meant that the person who did all this was thousands of times more powerful than him. It meant that he was absolutely an ant in front of that person. This person, I must find him. There are many people in this world who are stronger than me, but definitely none of them are this much stronger than me. This person must be an immortal who has ascended. If he isn't an immortal who has ascended, even if he is stronger than me, he won't have such a huge advantage. I must find him. The old soothsayer's mind was currently turbulent, and countless complicated thoughts were running through his mind. He had seen the Gate of Ascension for thousands of years, but during these thousands of years, no matter how hard he tried and how he cultivated, he couldn't move the Gate of Ascension. He couldn't even touch the Gate of Ascension. It was as if the Gate of Ascension was just an illusion that could be seen but not reached. For a cultivator, how helpless and sorrowful was this? Wasn't the goal of cultivators to ascend? No matter how powerful a cultivator was, as long as they hadn't ascended, they were still mortals. And as long as they were mortals, they would grow old, fall sick, and die, and they wouldn't be able to live forever. Only ascension could allow a cultivator to transcend the mortal world, allowing a cultivator to escape from birth, age, illness, and death. If a normal cultivator couldn't ascend, even if they used all the methods in the world to extend their lifespan would never exceed 10,000 years. The old soothsayer had lived for thousands of years, and he was only slightly more than 1,000 years away from the limit of 10,000 years. Over the past 1,000 years, the world would have changed 2 or 3 times for ordinary people, but to a cultivator, it was only the blink of an eye. Coupled with the fact that they were facing a great calamity, one could imagine how excited and shocked he was when a legendary immortal who had ascended suddenly appeared in front of him. With such thoughts in mind, how could the old soothsayer leave just like that? At that moment, he could not be bothered to pretend anymore. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. Countless strange lines flashed under his feet. After the lines passed, he had traveled more than 1,000 feet in just a few steps. He returned to the top of the mountain where he was originally at. This place was now empty. Apart from him, there was no one else here. Who is it? There are only a few hundred cultivators who have ascended since ancient times. Who is this immortal? The soothsayer stood on top of the mountain peak as a majestic aura gradually emanated from his body. It made him look like a completely different person than he was before. Luo Fan did not care about anything else at that moment. After he gathered the gold into a golden sphere with a diameter of 1,000 feet, he raised his hand and gently waved it. The golden particles that formed the golden sphere began to flow as he waved it. The way it flowed was very mysterious. Vaguely, they seemed to be constructing a strange formation. As it flowed, the golden sphere gradually shrank. Not long after, it had shrunk into a golden sphere the size of a fist. With another wave, it appeared in his hand. In the eyes of others, the sphere was constantly flowing and gradually shrinking. Finally, it shrank to the size of a fist. In a flash, it disappeared without a trace. He's definitely an immortal, the old soothsayer thought to himself. This kind of method had already exceeded the limits of his understanding. In his opinion, this kind of method was already beyond the limits of his understanding. In his opinion, only an immortal who had opened the Gate of Ascension could do such a thing. Master, the gold is gone. What do we do now? The old man beside Qian Tong asked. Go back. Qian Tong gritted his teeth and spat out these 2 words with some difficulty. Master, are we going to give up on the gold just like that? The old man was taken aback. Although gold is precious, the inheritance of the clan is the most important. To an existence that can easily take away the gold, we are nothing but ants in his eyes. If we anger him, it will be a disaster for our clan. Qian Tong's eyes had become firm. With a wave of his hand, he took the lead and walked down the mountain. But apart from the gold, there is still half of it left. Now that we have lost the gold, we can still fight for the other half, can't we? The old soothsayer asked in confusion. Although our Qian clan rules this area, we are still only one clan. If all the cultivators oppose us, then even the Qian clan will face the calamity of extermination. I have already said before that they can fight for the other half. If we break our promise now, we will offend all cultivators, and the consequences will be difficult to predict. It is not worth it for this gold. Qian Tong seemed to be trying to convince the old man, but also himself. When the old man and the others heard Qian Tong's explanation, they thought about it carefully and found that it was indeed the case. For a time, their gazes towards Qian Tong became filled with reverence and fanaticism. At this time, their hearts were filled with endless confidence. With such a patriarch, the future of the Qian clan would be incomparably bright, enough to greatly increase their confidence. After Luo Fan collected the other half of the gold, he disdained the remaining half. Turning around, he took a step forward and crossed a long distance, arriving in front of Han Er, who was looking for him several hundred kilometers away. Han Er, what are you looking for? Why haven't you come home with me? After appearing, Luo Fan ignored Han Er's dull expression and said, Yes. Han Er instinctively bowed and answered. Then, he quickly reacted and shouted, Young master, where have you been these past 3 days? I've been looking for you for a long time. If you hadn't appeared now, I would have left the Qian clan's territory to look for you outside. I was chosen by Master, so I went to cultivate in the cave Master opened these past 3 days. Enough nonsense, let's go back quickly. Master told me to bring something to Father. If I'm late, you can't blame me if Father punishes you, Luo Fan said with a faint smile. Master, then hurry up. Master isn't at home right now. He's at the place young Master and I went 3 days ago. Why don't we go there to see Master? Han Er said naively. As for Luo Fan's sudden appearance of a master, he was a bit confused. He didn't know why his young master suddenly had a master who had never appeared before. However, his limited brain matter allowed him to naturally put this doubt to the back of his mind. Instead, he began to speak according to Luo Fan's words. There's no need. Father has to go home sooner or later. Let's go home and wait for him. Luo Fan shook his head and said as he walked toward the city. Of course, Han Er would not have any other opinions. He immediately followed Luo Fan with a silly smile and went home together. For Han Er, as long as he found his young master, everything would be fine. As for everything else, what did it have to do with him? After returning home, they only sat for a while before Qian Tong and the others followed them into the house. Han Er, why are you here? Didn't I tell you to find the young master? As soon as Qian Tong entered the door, he saw Han Er sunbathing in the yard and couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Master, there's no need to look for him. I've found the young master, and he's at home now. Han Er hurriedly stood up and said to Qian Tong. When Qian Tong heard this, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. He only had one son in his life, Luo Fan, and his love for him was almost ingrained into his bones. Although he had remained calm for the past 3 days, he was extremely worried about Luo Fan and was constantly suffering in his heart. At this time, when he heard that Luo Fan was at home, although he hadn't seen him yet, he was already relaxed.